Can you hear me well enough now?
I didn't hear that. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Okay, but I don't hear you right now. That's weird.
Now it
Yep. Oh,
completely.
yeah. It's working.
It's working.
Yes, perfectly. Great. Okay. It's recording. Yeah. Okay. We're good. So people are pouring in right now here. It's we have some time, I guess.
Yeah, no worries. Okay.
You need an hour, which is fine. But or how much time do you think you need?
I think I can do it also in 45 minutes, so we can
Okay.
see.
That's perfect.
Is it encouraged that students can also interrupt me and ask questions, or?
All right. Yeah, it's a bit noisy, so I didn't quite catch it. But 45 minutes, I heard. That's
okay.
That's
no, I was wondering, should students ask questions also during the presentation or after?
whatever you want. So,
Okay.
I mean, if something's unclear, I would always say just it's good if they ask if they don't understand what you're saying. But otherwise afterwards, I think it's mostly afterwards anyway. But
okay, sounds good.
Okay, nice. Neem aan dat je het goed oké vindt als je jezelf voorstelt zo even, toch? Sure. Ja.
So who is this? There was a place. And it was why so you're saying here. Yeah.
That's correct, I would say. Yep. Okay. So again, welcome everybody. I hope everybody had a very good night's sleep after, I think, a very lovely evening yesterday with, again, I think a nice restaurant with, and so some bowling for some people afterwards. And anyway, so today we have moved from the impacts. We are moving from the impacts to equity aspects, and Elina is already online, and maybe I can show the program here, but she will start with normative considerations in the models and actions for improvements from the standpoint of from an equity standpoint. And then, and that's maybe a nice bridge segue to this person here, we're going to fair shares in climate action. And here is Mark Dekker, my esteemed colleague. And maybe you can introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a postdoc at the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Indeed, colleagues of Mathijs. And yeah, I work well, fair shares, obviously, also a little bit of impacts actually. So I think it's a nice bridge.
For sure.
And nice to meet you all.
So without further ado, Elina, I think we're okay. Can you say something once more?
Yes.
Yeah,
hello, everyone.
perfect.
Okay, you can hear me well. Good.
Maybe I can make the screen a little bit bigger. Oh, or I think you can, maybe by closing the notes. But if not, it's still fine. I think we can still see well. Nico, can you maybe dim the light a little bit? I think that's useful. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Show us how to start.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, it's really a pity that I cannot be there in person. I guess it sounds like I'm missing really lots of great activities as well. And I heard also, yeah, great exchanges in terms of topics and ideas. And today, again, kind of building on a few inputs that I already shared with you on Monday, I would like to dig deeper into these normative considerations in the models and actions for improvements. And I guess here, our thinking at the moment goes, I guess, or we try to summarize this in this figure, in this graph, that actually there are super many many entry points for normative considerations to enter a given scenario. So we have on the left side narratives, assumptions, constraints, and objectives that we are thinking about during IAM scenario generation. And then once, for example, we have one scenario and a possible temperature pathway, so this is the black dot in the middle, then there are also a lot of entry points for normative considerations in terms of scenario interpretation. So here, that's why we also have on the right-hand side goals, norms, and priorities. And these normative considerations can actually be motivated also by different communities and different disciplines. So quite often, especially in the context of Paris Agreement, right, we try to think about, okay, what are the principles that are already stipulated in global treaties, environmental law, and how we can translate in our narratives or really quantify it in specific model parameters. But of course, there's also lots of work that can simply come from other disciplines like philosophy. So we already introduced a little bit the thinking about justice theories and different perceptions there. So as you can see, I think here our also kind of core assumption is that basically any decision can be considered a normative decision. And what would be great is to try to be a bit more systematic and explicit along the whole scenario generation. What type of decisions, what type of assumptions do they make? And also be a bit more transparent. So I think this was also one of the insights that I showed on Monday, that transparency in this context is also one of the core calls from experts from other disciplines towards the IAM community. And in this context, quite often, especially as someone who, for me, who has worked a bit on the feasibility concept, I think within this area as well, as we go maybe towards more normative scenarios and thinking about different dimensions of justice. Something that also came up when we were presenting some of our research to different communities is that maybe some of the pathways or scenarios that we explore, that we generate, might be too ideal and can be never reached in the real life. And should we even go in this direction, or simply maybe focus on what could be called more realistic or more feasible? And here recently, I also reading more the political philosopher's view on this topic, so feasibility versus justice. I came across Immanuel Kant's work, as I guess he had something to say about almost everything within political philosophy. And also here I thought is a good point to say that quite often it's very important to explore this ideal or normal, kind of highly, what we would consider highly maybe unrealistic states. Still, even if we think that maybe it's not really attainable, or that we have not reached something like this or managed something like this in the past, because it can really help with more systematic thinking about how still to develop strategies to come closer to this ideal state. So I thought this very much also fits well to lots of discussions around 1.5 degrees, but also, for example, our thinking in terms of convergence across regions from the development perspective and so on. So that's why I wanted to highlight this. And with this overview, I wanted again to show that if we try to think about scenario generation, and again, with this justice considerations that I introduced on Monday a little bit, again, that can be different areas, different scopes, different forms of justice, different metrics, and different patterns. This all can enter scenario generation either already at the narrative stage, and I think here we can also have some qualitative elements as well as quantitative elements. It can enter also through core model assumptions. And of course, a lot can also happen, what I call here post-processing. And again, I'm not gonna be able to cover all these areas, and probably is not really also completely exhaustive, all the examples that we have here, but this is also just to give you an overview of the efforts that are out there, and that actually there is also quite a lot of going on in terms of how to bring in certain normative considerations or justice considerations into models. And for example, if we start with the narratives, I think here, and something that I will also introduce more in my presentation, so with SSP, shared socioeconomic pathways, then we can have different extensions of SSPs. And there's also recently much more work towards, for example, demand-driven strategies, so kind of really going beyond GDP as a metric of well-being, and trying to think of narratives where access, for example, to key energy services is at the center. We could also think about, and I think this also what relates mostly to Marina's work on gender equality, and how to develop also new narratives that would consider gender equality more, make it more as a core element within justice considerations. And so basically there are many, again, options what to do, and different work in progress that is already taking place. And to link it to what through Outlook, and to what, for example, are the recent calls in the literature, what could be the next steps. And I think there are also, again, already some ongoing efforts. But here would be, for example, narratives which really put, for example, this beyond growth narratives more at the center, or really focus much more on this convergence of need satisfiers. And also, for example, integrate really much more different stakeholders in, or more systematically from different regions already at the narrative generation stage. So within the core model assumptions, and I think here also a lot of work has been focusing on intra and intergenerational justice aspects, and especially as within global integrated assessment models, we work with regions, so how to introduce differentiated effort sharing across regions. And so here we have on one hand examples with differentiated carbon prices, especially work by Nico, but also now different examples, for example, from the Engage project, where this was introduced by also regional differentiated carbon prices, but linked to different governance levels across regions. Or here the work by a colleague at IASAS at UPELS, for example, differentiates efforts by imposing different regional carbon budgets. We can also think more systematically of stricter sustainability constraints as kind of default setup in the models, and to also address justice for future generation. Lots of thinking went, for example, into discount rates and how to adjust discount rates. And in terms of outlook, and this is also something that I will focus more a bit in my presentation, could be also even to think about alternative objective functions within the model, or how to better represent heterogeneity of actors, include explicitly, for example, representation of resource needs, and so on. And also here, of course, one could again somehow think about how to integrate stakeholders also a bit more systematically, and develop new tools, how to get feedback on some of the core assumptions within the models, which is, of course, here also challenging because quite often this part also becomes quite technical. And where I think really a lot has been done in the recent years is on the post-processing side. So here, what do I mean by post-processing is that there are more and more tools that are available where you can take the scenario outputs, for example, from the most recent ER6 database collection, and where you can assess indicators that are relevant, for example, from the justice perspective to well-being. And here we could, for example, assess risk of hunger, or we could assess unemployment shifts, so the shift based on the shifts in the energy sector. More or less, we could understand what, for example, the shifts in the fossil sector employment. There are also tools to assess health impacts, so in terms of air pollution, or mortality from air pollution, or impacts also from climate change. There are also growing efforts to include more income inequality. So, for example, also how different variations of carbon prices then affect also different income deciles within a certain population. And so on. So as you can see here, is also a lot going on. And I think what is kind of the outlook and a challenge also here is because as well, if we take more the perspective of using these indicators to better understand implications on well-being, the challenge is that there are many indicators, and the question is how can we also better represent and visualize this complexity, and also communicate this to different communities. And also here I guess it would be great to involve more stakeholders. So now that I gave you this a big overview, I will then have a deep dive into some of the examples and highlight again some of the core readings or studies, which I think would be also interesting for some of you to get into the topic. And again, getting back to the scenario narratives, I guess here we have different purposes of scenarios or different storyline methods that we could have. And I think especially within this area of justice and equity, quite often we are focusing on this normative part of storyline method, where again we are explicitly focusing on certain desired futures, a certain desired end state or goal, and so therefore quite often or at the moment we are maybe not so concerned with feasibility concerns or whether this is really a realistic representation of current trends, because we really want to show with this, okay, what are the implications of achieving a certain desired state, or what needs to be done under this, under ideal conditions, for example. And just a brief review, and I'm sure most of you know of this. So the core really are lots of kind of starting point for many scenarios are the assumptions about socioeconomic development. And so here we have these 5 SSPs. So the most widely used and dominant one is SSP2, so middle of the road. Then we also have SSP1, that is quite often also or frequently not as frequently as SSP, but still also often introduced in studies as the kind of more optimistic future, the sustainability and taking the green road narrative. So here in this SSP1, for example, could also be used as a starting point already from the justice perspective, where we already have a bit more equality. And the opposite of that would be, for example, the SSP4, but also SSP3, where we have lots of regional rivalry and a so-called rocky road. And as I mentioned before, so these are quite often our starting points, but there's been, of course, lots of also development here saying that we can have a slightly different variation of SSPs, or that we need to develop this further, or there could be alternatives. And for example, one example that I wanted to highlight would be also the low energy demand scenario, where again here one kind of goes away from the assumption that population and GDP growth drive the energy consumption, and rather builds up bottom up what would be the needs for to satisfy kind of the also decent living standards across the world, and under optimistic assumptions for technology development, what would be the implications also for energy needs and final energy demand by 2050. And so in this scenario, for example, I just wanted also to highlight that one can, again, assume kind of in a very normative way what would, for example, happen in terms of available space or residential floor space per capita. So here was the assumption that there would be a convergence around the world between global north and global south. So for example, in this scenario, there are only two core regions, so global north and global south, that at the same time consumer goods, so for example, like device ownership increases both in the global south and global north. Important kind of improvements are also within the mobility sector, that, for example, especially in the global north, access to mobility increases quite a lot, while there is not so much growth in the north, and that also in terms of food supply, there's a growth to especially eliminate malnutrition. So you can see there's also an opportunity to work a bit with this normative assumptions about how, for example, access to key services develop or converges. And this was, for example, then linked to the assumptions on efficiencies and improvements in the technologies, so which enabled a reduction, a quite substantial global reduction on final energy demand by 2050. So here's one example that wanted to highlight that we can have a relatively low final energy while really improving the quality of life for most of the people, and especially for the global South region. And again, but at the same time, I think this this scenario or this approach was challenged from the feasibility perspective, because there were then also studies that were showing that we have not actually observed much of behavioral change or much of final energy demand decrease historically. And another, I guess, that was probably also you already heard about or will hear about, are also the so-called SDP scenarios, so Sustainable Development Pathway scenarios. And here, for example, they also developed kind of three distinct narratives. So economic innovation narrative, moderate convergence narrative, and reduced consumption narrative. And here I wanted to highlight also the work by colleague Ji-Hoon Min, who in this context then developed also different GDP trajectories. So this is to highlight to you and to show that one can also work with GDP trajectories and growth assumptions. And so in this context, for example, we have there's this one pathway, and I think this aligns also a bit more with the patterns kind of thinking that I introduced on Monday. So we can have one trajectory or pathway where low and middle income countries all grow, let's say by 15% or have a boost. No, this is only for low income countries, and in this one, no changes for high income countries. Then in the second narrative, we have moderate convergence, where we have in a reduction in high income countries by 50% and lower reductions of growth in others. And then we have the so-called the reduced consumption, where high income countries transition to zero growth. So again, this is just to highlight to you that one, of course, can also really work a lot, for example, with some of the foundational assumptions in scenarios that then I think drive a lot the results and develop these different narratives. And again, this can be on the qualitative as well as on the quantitative side. So now I wanted also to highlight what can be done or what has been done within the core model assumptions or the entry points there. And as I already mentioned, so for example, one also criticism towards recent criticism towards a global IAM community was the very high level of deployment of biomass. And here was the concern that then too much land will be used for that, and that might have some trade-offs with food prices, food consumption, food security, but also with biodiversity. And for example, one solution to this could be to set really much stricter biomass upper bound levels in the models, like as a default, so that we say we agree that we should use very little land for or as much as possible for biomass production, And for example, this is just, again, one of the possible calculations from the study, also from a colleague from YASA. So where one could use, for example, instead of higher levels of yearly biomass production, something lower like 170 exajoules per year, or maybe to be more aligned with protecting 1/3 of global land coal, something around 130 exajoules per year by 2050. And there are also overview studies, for example, by Felix Kreuzig, where this value is more around 100 exajoules per year. So again, there is some, of course, variation and uncertainty, but here the main point is that one can maybe agree also here on, as I said, having a default stricter constraint. Some of the discussions about also geological carbon storage also go in a similar direction, that there should be a more kind of stringent also limit on where geological storage is possible, and that especially environmentally sensitive areas, for example, should be excluded from that. Then, as I already mentioned, also the effort sharing implementation. So here we have the work, especially within the Remind team, a lot of kind of thinking of how to differentiate carbon prices, but also this work links to how, for example, NDCs are implemented in the models. So we have also regional differentiation there. And for example, I wanted to introduce also the work, recent work by Cedric Pelt. So here his suggestion is to constrain regional CO2 FFI budgets. So this is basically CO2 within the energy and industry sector, to exclude agriculture, because there's also quite a lot of uncertainty in terms of emissions in the agricultural sector, and lots of model variation there. And he's kind of, and this is something also that we are working on currently. So his proposal is also that we can take, let's say, a global carbon budget that is more aligned with a certain temperature goal, and then given different equity principles to try to calculate the regional budgets. And these regional budgets are then the constraints in a model run. And this way we can see also how this differentiated effort sharing through regional carbon budgets affect, for example, the feasibility also of our, so the model feasibility of our scenario, and what are, for example, the implications, in terms of the necessary scale up of other technologies, and so on. So yeah, this is, I think, also relatively from the technical perspective, on a relatively straightforward process, which I think is a bit more challenging is also to think about, because for some regions we will find already now for 1.5 degree targets, they're already exhausted their regional budget, or they're already almost in the negative, or have already negative numbers. So here, Sergio also coined the term of carbon debt. And I guess here the question or the implication is that then countries would need to do emission trading. And here a difficult question is, okay, how much trading should they do for a given place of time, or how do we constrain it? And for the, apart from the concern of how to introduce more justice considerations across region, we are also concerned how to introduce more justice for future generations or across generations. And here you will probably also know about the work and a lot of thinking about the discount rate. And here I wanted to highlight the study by Johannes Emmerling from the from CMCC, And here in one of the studies, it was shown that, as expected, discount rate significantly shapes emission reduction strategies, and it affects when net zero emissions are reached, also the size of the carbon budget overshoot and carbon price trajectories. And just to give the main insight from the study, so reducing the discount rate from 5 to 2% doubles the current carbon price, but also cuts carbon budget overshoot by half, and also substantially reduces reliance on negative emissions, but by approximately 300 gigatons over the century, which again, I think, over reliance on negative emissions is again a major concern that was also raised towards some of the more recent scenarios from the global IAM community. So I think here also try to think, what are the drivers actually also in the models of higher reliance on negative emissions, and also how one could adjust it or explore different options is quite important. And so, for example, one of the ways to do that is through working around with the discount rate. And in other sense, I think there is also lots of, as already mentioned, intersections between philosophical thinking and also the thinking that we currently have in the IAM community. I also wanted to highlight a relatively still recent study from 2023 where it was explored, okay, what actually experts think about what should be the discount rate within the two communities of philosophers versus economists. And here, as the also title of the study suggests, actually both communities sort of agree that 2% is an appropriate discount rate, but for different reasons. So the economists often focus on technical aspects such as uncertainty and environmental scarcity, while philosophers prioritize ethical concerns or normative considerations, and also this element of intergenerational justice, so the rights of future generations and present-day duties beyond consequentialism. So this also an example where I guess one can also use work and findings from other communities to, for example, justify or explore different assumptions, and for this enhance the existing scenario space. So, and something a bit more radical, and also I think a super interesting study from another colleague from another team at YASA, Piotr, who's actually a mathematician in his background. And here he, in his article from 2022, he actually proposed to think about, okay, how can we even change the objective function in the global IAMs? And this is also quite super interesting article, because it presents also different philosophical theories and thinking and approaches, and really tries to quantify them. However, of course, this has not been yet applied into integrated assessment models, because I think that's also is quite challenging or would require quite a lot of work. But if you're interested, you could also explore the option that he, for example, proposes. And he says, he also kind of discusses a little bit the point of the criticisms that maybe IAMs or global IAMs are not the right tools to explore some of the equity principles or of introducing justice considerations. And his take is that actually, since also the models at the same time can be quite flexible, and you can alternate or experiment a bit with the objective functions. So theoretically, you could explore quite many different concepts and approaches from philosophy in global integrated assessment models. And so the starting point is, again, that most IAMs focus on maximizing total global utility and not so much the impacts on regional utilities. But of course, this can be, again, adjusted, and there can be also different utility aggregation methods that can reflect different perceptions of fairness. So here he also builds on the point that I raised on Monday, that we also differentiate between justice, equity, and fairness. And let me check if in the next slide, and again, I might not be able to really explain to you also all the different, the thinking at the background of the different social ranking approaches. But the core idea is that one can introduce more this separateness of agents. And here the idea is, again, that we don't try to look into optimizing, let's say, the global utility and pick an option with the highest global utility, but rather try to give equal importance to well-being of every individual involved. And another key condition also for the separateness of agents from philosophical thinking is that also the final decision of policy outcome should be understandable and justifiable to each person from their own point of view. And so here there would be, again, this focus on kind of disaggregating a bit the different agents and trying to think how to rank kind of their utilities. And as I said, there are many different ways also how to do it. And in this paper, you would also read more about how this could be done, mathematically. And after a few of these core examples from some of the core assumptions that we could work with as entry points for justice considerations, I also wanted to explain or give examples of a few post-processing tools. And as I shown on Monday, surprisingly, there are actually not so many studies within the global IAM community that would, they are, but just not as many compared to many other indicators or approaches that would focus on the health impacts. And I think, I wanted also to show to you that there are actually now two tools or two models that could be used for post-processing of results, for example, from global integrated assessment models. So one model is a FAST model, and here also a colleague from which team, Lara, also developed, I think, an R tool also for using FAST model in the context or with the outputs from global IAMs. So this, for example, would give you based on the, this would give you based on the emissions trajectories from a certain scenario, a set of, for example, mortality from air pollution, and also depending on different impact functions. So here that you can also understand, for example, the uncertainty of that estimation. And then another model, for example, gains model, and I'm not sure whether this is finished, but there was also the idea that, for example, with tools like a scenario explorer, it will be in the future also possible to, by using gains post-processing, to also see the air pollution implications on health, or at least more the air pollutants levels for any scenario. So I think, given that health is also a big dimension of individual well-being, and I guess then also in the context of a broader context of justice, I think this is also important development, and hopefully there'll be more easier ways to use these tools in the future, and also more like a default setup. And another post-processing tool that I wanted to also highlight is the work from a colleague from YASA, by Jarmo Kikstra, who works on decent living standards or decent living energy, also concepts. And recently he published a study where he presents his the called desire model, where again, there's the outputs of IAM scenarios. So here in this paper, he showed how this model works based on image and remind Magpie. So where it's possible, basically, on based on the outputs from IAMs to assess energy or decent living gaps. As you can see, these are the set of variables that needs to be reported for this assessment to work. And then based on this and a set of quite many also additional assumptions that are needed, the energy inequality is projected, the average energy consumption is projected, and then minimum energy needs and efficiencies. And based on this model can then report energy deprivation head count, so share of population below minimum for decent living standard. And this way we can understand a little bit better, given a certain scenario, what are the for example, whether there's still remaining energy need gaps in certain regions or not. So this was also something that was, for example, criticized in some recent articles about some of the IAM scenarios, that there is no convergence in terms of primary energy per capita use across the regions. And the point that this article makes is that this is also not so easy actually to simply compare. So energy outputs per capita and what it implies in terms of actually access to services is very context dependent and also so region dependent, but also scenario dependent. So again, it makes a big difference, right? Which technologies we use, how efficient they are, and then what this implies into in terms of energy needs, and essentially also in terms of energy needs gaps. So we can have, for example, as I already highlighted a little bit with a low energy demand scenario, so we can have two scenarios where in one region maybe the energy per capita consumption is much lower as compared to another scenario, but where the access to services and actually is much higher. So this is, I think, also very, very important and useful work. And the challenge at the moment is also that we have so much variation in terms of what models report across these key output variables, and some of them are not always completely harmonized. So I think here we also work in terms of developing a generic tool that would enable a much easier this post-processing calculations. And of course, here also based on this, the idea is that essentially we can also bring it directly into the model, so we can make sure that in our scenario narrative and then in the trajectories that we have as a core inputs into our model, we make sure that all regions are above decent living standards in terms of access to key services. And just to wrap up a bit, coming back again to this slide, which I'm showing again also because it took quite some time to create the animation, so I wanted to use it a bit more. But I again tried to follow also in my presentation again this kind of the chain along the scenario generation. And again, just to sum up and highlight the points that I made already on Monday, still the the challenge remains is to involve more communities, and how at the beginning of scenario developments, and to diversify research teams, and also to build capacity in other countries. And again, here, there's really lots of effort, or has been traditionally always lots of effort across many different projects to bring different communities in, but the challenge, still remains. And I think, one maybe also of the outlooks or step forwards would be to again try to have more efforts to have researchers who have more also interdisciplinary backgrounds, so for example, who would understand also quite well the lots of discussions that are happening in philosophy, but that can also relate to integrate assessment, modeling work and community, because as I have shown, quite a lot of thinking, especially within the justice dimension, is linked to lots of work by philosophers. And here also, again, to identify in a useful way as well, how much should we enhance the scenario space. So I think also one of the challenges here is, again, as we see, there is already quite a lot, and we are trying to bring in more diversity and more scenarios. At the same time, this also brings the challenges, of course, of communication. So if you have too many things, this might be also overwhelming as towards, let's say, our audience or policymakers. I think this is also a key challenge in this area, while at the same time, we want to explore more and different and more justice focused narratives and assumptions, right? Again, there's another community that always challenges this from this kind of feasibility or realism possibility consideration. And within the core assumptions, I think here as well, we have some, we have some also efforts, and I think here would be also great to also try to think about how to bring maybe some of the ongoing efforts, especially within the core kind of model, default model assumptions, a bit more together under this umbrella, and thinking of justice considerations. And as we have seen, also really lots already happened and is happening also in terms of post-processing and how to interpret the results. And here also challenge, similar to what I mentioned before, is the complexity and also how to communicate better these core indicators or multidimensional indicators, such as well-being, in a more coherent and also accessible way. I think more or less also in time, and we also wanted to leave some time for questions, so I will maybe turn off the sharing.
So first of all, Nina, I think a lot of key concepts you discussed were also a bit touched upon yesterday with the work in the workshop. I think that links back quite well, and I think it was super useful and interesting and nice. We have a bit of a problem with making everybody understandable for you, so I'll try to again turn my laptop.
Thank you.
If it's not if you can't hear it, then I'll repeat the question.
Thank you.
So we have definitely room for quite a few questions. So is there anybody who Lucas has one here.
Thanks for the presentation. Maybe it's also a little bit detailed question, but I was wondering, when you have this effort sharing with differentiated carbon prices and trading, which price you then use, like how this works. Because there's one carbon price, and I'm okay, just pay this carbon price for, I don't know, trading emission certificates, but yeah, the differentiated prices. I just wondered how that works. Thanks.
Did you catch that or no?
Not fully. Maybe if you could summarize this for me. Sorry.
So which carbon price did you use in your assumptions? And particularly in... Yeah.
3 weeks. Now there's one carbon price, then you get this price. But then you have different CO2 carbon price for reaching how the trade of how that works. But also can jump back.
Yeah, so I mean, oh, sorry. Again, I don't know, you might have heard it, Elina?
Yeah, I will try. I think maybe I understood sort of basically there is a bit of a trade-off between carbon price and the amount of trading that we assume. And I think this was also quite nicely shown on financial transfers that we need. This was very well shown in especially Nico's paper. And I think, yeah, in Setu's work at the moment, so basically what we have in the message setup, so we start with a certain global carbon budget, and then we have this regional and the regional budgets based on let's say different equity principles. And if we are within a very kind of ambitious carbon budget, without any financial transfers, we cannot even find a feasible solution in the model, right? So there is, there is no kind of feasible, let's say, or high enough, carbon price. And so what we have there would be then always some sort of financial transfers or trading necessary. And this would adjust a little bit or lower the carbon price needs. And then later in Setu's work, so yeah, it's unfortunately not published yet. Then Setu also shows basically how this exactly works then with the higher budgets, less ambitious budgets, and there we can show really the difference basically across the regions. In a standard global carbon price setup versus if we have this regional differentiation. And of course, there with this regional differentiation, as expected, we would have a really much higher carbon price in the developed region as compared to developing countries. Yeah, I hope I got this a bit right with the question.
Yes, I think so. Thanks. Still had a question here?
Yes, it's quite a specific question, but when you were introducing the low energy demand scenario, what I was a bit confused about was that it was demanding for, like, for example, a growth in agricultural production. And from like my perspective, I'm feeling like it's not necessarily a problem of production, but more a problem of distribution. So I was wondering if there's any like idea to include this distribution dimension actually in the scenarios, because that would also apply to, I guess, consumer goods and all of that, because it doesn't necessarily have to buy more in a certain country, but you have to distribute it differently amongst the population within the country, not just within like global work regions and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, this is very, very good question. And I think maybe here I can then also put as a study by colleagues that I didn't present here, but of course within their efforts as well to calculate basically what would be the energy needs or like consumption needs, also like food consumption needs, if we would reduce the within country inequality, right? And so colleague Millward Hopkins, Joel Millward Hopkins, again, I can share the study because he had quite, I think, 2 or 3 articles that kind of looked into this dimension and did the calculations. And they also related their work to this low energy demand scenario and the calculations in the context of decent living standard. And as you say, they could show, that, of course, if you reduce also within country inequality, that there could also be quite a lot of less consumption needs. I think here something that we also struggle in another project is to also justify the assumptions, kind of how much do you reduce the inequality. But again, I think this is, for example, also explored a little bit more in this study in the studies by Joel. So I will maybe upload it also as under suggested readings, because I think that's also an interesting point.
Thanks. Maybe one last question, and maybe one comment also to you and everybody, actually. So I made a folder in the study material folder with literature, and you have so much core reading material also in your presentation, also since you're mentioning it now. So if you have it readily available, it would be great if you could put some of these papers in there, I think.
Exactly. Yep, we'll do. I think I also tried to check. I think most of the papers are also open access that I was suggesting as a core reading.
Yeah, a link is also fine, but I think, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Is there any last pressing question? The audience seems quite clear. Nico has one.
Just as a comment to the previous question on food. So the food issue becomes more and more important, as also Elina pointed out, and the food security issue and the risk of hunger, and whether food issues are avoiding the eradication of poverty, which is the SDG #1, the most important one. And on the distributional issue, there's also the food waste, which is very important. And that a reduction of waste already is something very important. Then when you reduce the inequality by boosting incomes of low-income households, you basically increase food demand overall. Yeah, because low-income households start to not necessarily eat more, but eat more meat. Yeah, and then we have also now more and more studies on the dietary changes, so that the increase of meat consumption is slowed down, or in high-income countries even decreasing to what is called the Eat Lancet diet. And this is very important to bring down livestock production and the very, very large land demands that it brings with it, and the CH4 emissions. Yeah, also nitrogen pollution, which is a local issue also. And then when it comes to the production side, which something that should not be undervalued, is you have huge yield gaps, especially in developing countries of sub-Saharan Africa. So the potential to increase the production of food in these areas is really, really large. It's up to 80%. Yeah. Excuse me, the yield gap is 80%. So you could even quintuple the yield rates in these areas. It's a matter of technology and access to fertilizers and so on.
The last short reaction, yeah? Or no? Oops.
Actually, like for example, the global south. But the question is like, what are the side effects of that for the region? Yeah. So there's like a lot of, it's not just a question who produces where, but also a question who produces where for whom. So the question is like, where do you then like put the fruit? Do you put it on the local market and the people who are like surrounding the agriculture area can live from it, or are you producing it for global exports, which is currently happening a lot of times? And then also, what are the side consequences for like people living there when you, for example, start introducing very industrial agriculture, which is then leading to all the side effects of biodiversity, ecosystem destruction, and potential also social impact. So the question is like, that's why I asked about the distribution issue, because I think it's so many layers in that, which is more than just like boosting production, and we're fine.
Are Dutch tomatoes still offered in sub-Saharan Africa?
Oh, sorry.
I think that's still the case because they are so cost competitive here to produce tomatoes that they can compete in sub-Saharan Africa on the markets. It's still the case in a few years.
Oh, I have no idea.
So Europe exports wheat to developing countries, for example. Yeah.
With that, I think we're moving to the next presentation. Elina, it would have been lovely to have you here. Oh, losing you. But
Thanks
yeah,
a lot.
I mean, thank you. And I think if anybody has questions, I assume you're reachable. And yeah, so next summer school, it's great to have you in person. But yeah, you had super valuable inputs, and thanks again. Then
And thanks everyone.
great. One last round of applause. Right. Yeah. So then, Mark and Jan, I don't know if you use your own laptop, which is fine.
I did, unless you guys are saying. I did upload it to the drive.
Okay, so should we, use that?
Maybe easiest.
Right. One second. Ooh. Yeah.
Are you looking at the link?
Yes.
It's
No, I have it. I have it.
I don't see it, and also when I upload it, there were far fewer. So let's go with mine.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. It's not there. It's not there. It's quite easy to. Yeah, maybe you did in the study material folder. If you use it. Was in the study material. It's both.
Okay.
It's both fine. It's both.
That should be fine. Yeah, I have a screenshot. So that should be. Thank you. Maybe I turn on Teams.
That's actually good if you turn on Teams, but
Really?
because you can then share it within Teams.
Okay.
So I'm using the.
Then I have to dig up the Teams link.
Yes, I just used the last meeting we had. Last is fine.
Just send it at some point, right?
If you open Teams, you see it right away. If you just mark the one of the chats. We're not in a huge hurry, so we can go a little bit into.
So we're good.
We're not.
Why not?
Yeah, I mean we're 8 minutes, but
So it's
the break is quite long.
oh, is it just the summers?
I mean, if you go to the chat or so, then here use summer.
This might.
Top, yeah. If you join that one.
Okay. That's really long. Yeah, can I? All right.
Depends.
Yeah. Okay, and then we share screen. Where's the button?
Then we're recording, with
That's fine.
Your slides. So that's
Sure, that's fine. But where's the button? Oh, here. Yeah. And then
I
this.
think the other one. So you were.
No, I'm showing this.
Perfect. Yep.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Should I start?
I mean, you're starting anyway. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Can you introduce yourself?
So I guess we can start now. We finally set everything up. Yeah, so I was just now already introduced, but again, very nice to be here and to meet you all. Yeah, again, Mark Dekker, working at PBL, colleague of Mathijs, and together with Jan, we've been working a lot on fair share. So we have kind of a co-hosted presentation, I guess, and you're starting. So.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll start a little bit. So maybe the beginning, the introduction will be based greatly on, of course, my work in this field, but also my experience outside academia. So for 5 years, I was working with NGOs and think tanks and diplomats of Europe, but also some vulnerable countries for a project we did with Mark. So it's trying to look a little bit at the reason why we're working on fair shares. You have heard that term in many presentations, and then Mark will explain how it is quantified more technically in a paper that just came out in Nature Climate Change that he led. And then we'll give some discussion on what we think can be upcoming questions, also related to what Elena presented. So here's a maybe personal reading of my understanding of the role of fair share. So this starts with before I started to do research, but basically on the history of the UNFCCC that was created after the Rio Convention, but there was discussions for the Kyoto Protocol around 97 and the years after that on how much developed countries, and there was a list of exactly who they were by how much they should reduce their emissions. And so then my understanding is that then there was a fair share literature developed to try to share the remaining emission space. So first it wasn't 1.5 degrees, but there was this idea of sharing efforts across countries on how much they should reduce their emissions. And so that's the IPCC figure from the IPCC fourth assessment report in 2007. I don't know actually if there was something in the previous ones, but basically what we can see here is that there's a synthesis of the literature that told how much Annex 1 countries, that means developed countries, should reduce their emissions. And for non-Annex 1, there was no specific number. And I think this actually is greatly based on the work of Mathilde Nansen at PBL. But basically, this was the sort of first synthesis by the IPCC of how much countries should reduce their emissions. Then in the history of UN negotiations, there was the failed Copenhagen Agreement, failed in the sense that it wasn't seen as a major step forward. It was signed by countries, but they basically agreed to, they pledged 100 billion of financial funds, but they agreed to limit global warming to 2 degrees, but there was no real architecture as to who should do what. But then in Durban or Cancun, countries agreed to agree by COP21, which will be the Paris Agreement. So they agreed to come up with an agreement on climate change and also on effort sharing after, to some extent, provide more guidance on effort sharing after the failure of Copenhagen. And so in the IPCC R5, so the following assessment report that came out in 2013-14, that was also basis for negotiations ahead of the Paris Agreement. And so in this figure, you can see this is still a synthesis of the existing literature on effort sharing And you can see that here there's more details, so you probably can't read here, but there's different visions of fairness, so more categories based on capability, so ability to pay, equality, historical responsibility, and there's also more details on world regions. So that's OECD, economies in transition, Asia, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. So there was more details. What you can see here is also it gets maybe harder to interpret how much you should be reducing your emissions. There's a very wide spread, and because you give more information, sort of broken down by category, by region, you get a larger spread. And here you can see for OECD it goes more than 100%. So that's emissions reduction by 2030. So there was this synthesis. So that's basically, how much all countries should reduce their emissions. And then there's been the Paris Agreement. So now it's moved. So the Paris Agreement basically says that countries should pledge their own, suggest their own pledge, and they should explain how their pledge is fair and ambitious. But there's no top-down mechanism. There's no set targets as in the Kyoto Protocol that says exactly how much each country should reduce their emissions. So now it's moving also from suggesting new targets to assessing the ambition of existing targets for the purpose of the Paris Agreement. So the question is, also under the Paris Agreement, countries should update their targets every 5 years and improve them. So it has to be a progress in emission, but there's no formal real negotiations mechanism, but there's some discussion. There's a stock take under the UNFCCC. So also for scientists, the question is, how do we assess the ambition of these different pledges, the fairness, but also the compliance with the Paris Agreement? There was a quote in the last IPCC report that also clarified this, saying it is only in relation to such fair shares that the adequacy of a state's contribution can be assessed in the context of global collective action problems. So the only way to assess ambition towards a collective goal is to consider countries as fair share when we're talking about countries. And then this, she's a jurist, Lavanya Rajamani. She also then worked with some colleagues of ours on trying to clean in certain ways, trying to highlight which part of the literature on fair share was not consistent with international law. And so she suggested that some approaches had some perhaps suggestions by modelers as to what they thought could be an adequate contribution to the debate prior to the Paris Agreement, but that so basically she highlights that some of these modeling assumptions do not reflect or contradict the norm of the Paris Agreement. She highlighted that to some extent all studies had a fundamental problem that introduces a bias basically towards rich countries. We'll come back to it later. But that's a bit the question that is also being tackled at the moment, is how does that the modeling choices reflect legal frameworks? And maybe the upcoming question is also how much countries should have reduced their emissions. So we have the 1.5 degree carbon budget that's almost coming to zero. So if you just do a fair share of the remaining physical budget, there's nothing to share really left. So, I mean, Elina talked about it. There's this paper by Sid Pils. There's other works on this trying to quantify the how much climate debt, carbon debt there is. So then maybe reflecting on the object of fair share. So maybe this was already touched upon quite a lot, so I won't go into too much detail. I think Elena also talked about it, but basically, if we just look at the IAM results, it suggests how the global mitigation pathways can be implemented, but it doesn't imply, or maybe it implies, but it doesn't say that each country should pay for the mitigation options that happens on their soil, and otherwise this would represent a very high fraction of their GDP. So in that sense, it's not necessarily meant to be fair. It's meant to show cost optimal implementation. But there's still some need to access to funding. Not necessarily, even if we don't care about fairness, but there needs to be access to finance to fund the mitigation options where they need to be. Some countries yet in their climate pledges, like Norway, use these types of figures. So from the previous IPCC report to justify their emissions targets, even though, again, that's not what you're supposed to use. This is just about the mitigation potential. And again, you should use fair share. South Korea also used the grandfathering. So in the sense that they just looked at the emission objective that the world should have, and it just said, okay, we'll take the same, literally the same number. So decrease emissions at the same rate, but without considerations for capability or historical responsibility. All this work trying to show what's fair, of course, it's not necessarily upon the assumptions that it's exactly what should be adopted or will be adopted. That's open for negotiations. But fairness considerations do matter in international negotiations. This maybe echoes a bit what Detlef showed at the very beginning, but it's just so you know, it's what it looks like, cumulative CO2 emissions by countries. This is just in proportion also. So which countries contributed the most to current climate change, to put simply. Which greenhouse gas emissions are the highest? So that's excluding land use. And which GDP per capita is the highest? Sorry, emissions per capita also. Roughly, we see an overlap greatly between the highest polluters and the richest countries. And so where is equity? Maybe quickly in the Paris Agreement. Well, maybe I should have started with the next slide, but it's in many places. But there's in Article 2, it says that the agreement will be implemented. Will is a legal obligation to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So that's usually interpreted as historical responsibility and respective capabilities. A simple way to show that is often GDP, but there's no quantitative indicators in there. Countries should submit their climate pledge and they must reflect the highest possible ambition, whatever that means. And they should also indicate how they are fair and ambitious. And most NDCs, most climate pledges do not do that. The first US NDC just said our pledge is fair and ambitious, period. And some are very creative. There's some interesting also analysis of what type of language countries use. So fairness is the metric for ambition or assessing ambition or adequacy. And most countries, as I said, do not explain how they are fair and ambitious. And this is just to introduce what Mark will talk about when we talk about fair share. Of course, that doesn't encompass all the considerations of fairness. Fairness is everywhere in the Paris Agreement on mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology. This is a very simple way to a very simple quantitative framework in order to assess the ambition of countries' emissions pledges. So in terms of justice, that really focuses on distributive justice and particularly on mitigation efforts for now. Yeah.
Yes, then onto rather than maybe the conceptual part and the use of fair shares, onto what actually is a fair share. How do you define it? And the first question you can ask yourself is, well, you're talking about sharing. What exactly are you sharing? And Jan already hinted towards, say, the dominant approach in, say, history. So when around, say, 20, maybe 5 or 10, when there was quite some budget left, how fair shares were perceived then. But let's look at a couple of options that are currently in the literature on this. So the dominant one is based on, say, this graph, this very interesting linear relationship between cumulative CO2 and temperature. I found it fascinating, by the way, that this is linear, but we can talk about that.
Most complicated models in the world, and besides it's linear.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating, but there's a lot of complicated process behind this relationship, but it's very strong. And this is a relatively old picture already, but back then, this is what we emitted. And in recent past, we emitted actually a lot more. And then if you draw a line from 1.5 degree to, say, the intersection here, you can see that we have well, actually a very tiny budget left. And it's recently estimated actually to be around 130 gigatons of CO2 when you have a look for the 1.5 without any overshoot. And that's the first way of thinking about fair shares, looking at the cumulative CO2 budget to remain with any chosen climate target, and simply somehow divide that, perceive that as a pie. And then the question is, what size of slice do all the countries get? But again, this is a bit problematic because it's so small. Another way of looking at it is looking at emissions pathway, global emissions pathways, for example, from IAMs, that at least on a global scale are, well, by IAMs perceived as still feasible. And that could, for example, also incorporate forms of overshoot, forms of negative emissions, for example, and then look year to year how that on a global level, how that value on a global level is then distributed across countries. So you get pictures like this. This is a recent paper of ours. Yet another way is looking at IAM output and also regional IAM output, and then try to infer what if the mitigation would happen like IAMs indicate, what kind of investment needs would be required from that. There's also a very interesting paper by Pochari et al. That shows this. This is also a way of looking at effort sharing. And a third way, as I've mentioned a couple of times already, is basically embracing the overshoot problem. Looking at future and past emissions as the total pie, looking at the fair share of a country, and then look at how countries, in the past and their future emissions are spending their emissions, and then basically countries can start building up carbon debt that then in turn is suggested to be redistributed or compensated. So it's a paper by Setu Peltz et al. That also Jan and also Elina mentioned before. So that about the what is to be shared question. And then the question on what basis do we share? Jan already mentioned that there are actually many different options for this. Let's look at a couple of options. It's not meant to be comprehensive or exhaustive, but maybe just to give you a hint of how this way of thinking occurs. So it could start with Article 3 of the UNFCCC Treaty. This is the first part of that, and let's read through it together. The parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations. So that's already an interesting element, the element of intergenerations. Then of humankind, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities. It was also mentioned by Jan, but that's interesting, right? So it's a common responsibility together, but it explicitly indicates differentiated responsibilities. So that maybe some countries would do more than others, which already goes directly into what Jan indicated that South Korea is doing. And respective capabilities. Of course, you can define that also in different manners, but it's explicitly mentioned here. And then accordingly, the developed country parties should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. It's also interesting, the developed country parties should take the lead. And also later, which is, I think, very thematic for this particular summer school, impact also mentioned. So just a couple of elements that are already in the treaty, and maybe we can build on that. And many scholars have did. There's quite a pile of literature on this, and you get frameworks like this. So you can do this allocation problem. How you have a pie and you want to allocate that to different countries. You can do this in many different ways. Globally cost optimal is one branch, which IAMs do, or at least project. But that's not necessarily fair. And when thinking about fairness, especially with the previous slide, very often three main dimensions pop up, which are just abstract principles. Equality, focusing on every person, also in the future, counts equal, and maybe gets an equal amount of carbon credits, you could call it. Responsibility, taking into account that some countries have caused the problem, and are therefore responsible for the problem. So you factoring in somehow historical emissions. And capability, somehow the basis of that there are countries that it can more easily do mitigation. Either they're rich or it's relatively cheap to do mitigation there. So somehow building on that. But this is still abstract. And then it is to, well, scientists to somehow translate these principles to actual equations to get numbers. And this is tricky. You can do this in many different ways. And I explicitly say this because that involves a lot of normative considerations and also even scientific uncertainty that we will also be talking about today. And you get equations with terms like this. And so immediate per capita, agreement of development rights, ability to pay, these kind of terms you may have seen in literature that are somehow mathematical reflections of these broader principles that you can find in treaties, the Paris Agreement, etc. Okay, so let's go to some actual numbers. And I have the subtitle here, The Huge Uncertainty. We'll get back to it, because even through all these normative choices, scientific uncertainties, you actually can find robust messages. We'll get to that. So first, this graph. This is about emission, reductions on this side with respect to 2015 in 2035. Just for reference, I also added the 2030 NDCs here. For a couple of countries, I show here the 1.5 degree range of what will be globally cost optimal to do in these countries in 2035. This is relevant because, of course, this year, the 2035 NDCs are set globally, right? So that's why we made this graph in the first place. Already here you see what I think has been echoed a couple of times already this week. The idea that IAMs show for some countries, because it's relatively cheap there to do mitigation there, more mitigation in global cost optimal terms, for example, Brazil and Indonesia, then would be maybe fair to ask for money. And it's maybe not fair to ask the same reduction percentages in Indonesia as in Japan and the EU. Right, so it's very, very clear to see.
Is this total CO2?
No, this is GHG including land use, so it's everything. Yeah,
But
that's a good question indeed.
Below 100%.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's the reason. Okay, so just to start intuition a little bit on these numbers, what you would expect is that for a couple of, especially developing countries, the reduction percentages are a little bit less than what would be cost optimal, right? For a couple of countries, maybe it's roughly on the same order of magnitude. And for especially rich countries, you would expect the reduction percentages to be very high. Now, in practice, you will see this pattern, but a problem is that with these three branches of allocation rules, these equality rules, responsibility and capability, the results differ quite a lot. You will see this pattern, but still the actual results will differ a lot. And let me show you this with this picture first. So what we do here, every dot is a country. We show in colors which out of these three principles is the least stringent to that country. So we have axes here, GDP per capita and historical emissions per capita. So you see here the past polluters and the rich countries, which have the least stringent targets when focusing on equality. Well, you would argue the US has a super high per capita footprint, right, in terms of emissions. Well, that's true, but when you look at capability or responsibility of the US, it's simply that more stringent. And clearly from this graph, you see already based on these two axes, this very clear segregation in terms of what is favoring these countries. And this is also kind of the problem with maybe fair shares in general. It's not something that you can compute and everybody agrees on, because there are of course different interests and these results turn out differently for different countries. And that is something we will see.
One more question mark.
Yes, of course.
So these different countries are several dots, right? So we have a blue dot, yellow dot, and a purple dot, I guess.
No. So every country has one dot.
Okay.
Sorry, I just highlighted in the text here just a couple of countries, but every dot is a unique country.
I get that every dot is a country, but I thought you have different principles of sort of rating or sort of putting a country somewhere.
No, so
based on capability or on responsibility, I think USA would be somewhere else, or no?
So maybe then I would explain it again.
Sorry.
Because no worries. So here you have GDP per capita.
Mm-hmm.
And here you have historical emissions per capita.
Mm-hmm.
So every country has one position in this diagram, right? So for example, the US is over here. It's a very high GDP per capita and a very high historical emissions per capita.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
But it has one dot, which is over here. And then I plot all the countries like that. So you have Nigeria, which is over here, much lower, of course. Less historical emissions and less GDP per capita. But then I also give every dot a color. And I do that based on what's the least stringent for that country. So for the US, I give the blue color because it turns out that equality is out of these three principles, the least stringent for that country. And I show this to show the different interests of different country groups. Yes?
What does least stringent mean?
Yes, exactly that. Yeah, so if you look at these reduction targets, well, let's bridge it by looking at this diagram directly. So here I have the symbols are relatively small, so you'll have to believe me. But let's look at the US here. And again, this is about 2035 targets for all greenhouse gases, including land use. And we look at these three principles. The circle is here, the diamond here, and the responsibilities over here. You see that it's all more stringent, so they have to reduce more when you look at fairness than what would be cost optimal to ask from them. But there's clearly one that is less stringent than the others, and that is the point I also tried to make with the graph just now. And this is equality, and it's also the case for the EU and Japan. Yes. That was just population. Yeah. Yeah, just to highlight where a couple of big countries are. Yeah, and also the font is adjusted to that. So India, China are here, and the US is a big one over here, Brazil. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we talked about developed countries over here. For Nigeria, you see that actually the star, which is talking about historical responsibility, well, Nigeria, in terms of their population, actually have emitted very few in the past. So their star is actually somewhere here, so outside of the graph. So that when looking at the fair share of Nigeria, they have a lot of emission space left in the year 2035. But then let's add a couple of forms of uncertainty to this. For example, when looking at historical responsibility, how far back in time do you go? Do you go back to 1990 when you have the signing of the UNFCCC treaty? Or do you go back to 1900 or even 1850? And do you discount these emissions somehow? Do you say, you know, what my grandfather emitted, let's discount that with a certain percentage? Or do you not do that? And so these are normative questions that actually matter a lot. And specifically these parameters and a couple of others have been added here. And you see especially the uncertainty for the responsibility calculations explode. So this matters. And you'd argue, well, you still see some structure here, but it becomes even more problematic if you add, you know, uncertainty on non-CO2 emission projections. Uncertainty on, do you go for the 1.5 degree or the 2 degrees? And do you do that with a high climate sensitivity or a low climate sensitivity, which in turn always boils down or trickles down to what exactly is your fair share. So you may be kind of desperate if you think about this, and then maybe we shouldn't do this at all. But what we did in our paper is we kind of try to pull this uncertainty apart and categorize them in different groups of uncertainty to try to understand it a little bit better and to also understand how each form of uncertainty affects each country slightly differently, which may also explain certain behavior of countries in negotiations. And that results in a very complex figure. So brace yourself. It's this one.
These triangular graphs are so terrible.
So Nico, I'll walk you through. Yeah. So bear with me. Okay. So again, I was talking about different aspects of uncertainty. For example, a parameter related to even the temperature goal, non-CO2 emissions reduction. One related to the historical start year, so how far back in time do you go, etc. We group these in 3 categories. So one of the categories is everything related to normativity. So which of the 3 rules do you look at? Equality, responsibility, or capability? And this discounting of emissions, how far back in time do you go? That's all normative. So we group that in one dimension. The other on global strategies is about the temperature goal that you take. The timing of mitigation. Do we globally now go down, or is there a certain lag? You see that IAMs have different projections on that. Also negative emissions is up there. And then you have a branch of that are actual physical and social uncertainties related to population projections, but also related to climate sensitivity. And of course, none of these things is perfectly in one of the 3 branches. In a sense, you could argue that everything is normative, but this is a rough categorization to try to grasp it a little bit better. And then we compute using a Sobol decomposition. Maybe some of you know this. We compute how each of these groups of uncertainty factors affect the fair share of each country. So let's look at the US, for example, which is over here. From the start of the century, from the start of now, basically, towards the end of the century, all fair share calculations that they have are completely dominated by normative discussions. So whether you go to 1.5 degree or 2 degrees, such global considerations is actually not that important for the fair share of the US, because for them, it's very important if you think responsibility should be the way to go versus equality or all kind of normative considerations. They're that dominant to the fair share of the US. Well, for example, if you look at Mexico, this is quite the opposite. So this way, we can study it further in the coffee break. This way, we try to get a bit of a grasp on how each of these factors plays a role for different countries. Yes? Sure. Yeah, sure. No, good question. Sure. So let's look at Mexico. So it starts all the way there, which Mexico is a bit peculiar, and you see that also in mid-century China, for example, here, and at the end of century India. Those are cases where, for different reasons, the equity calculations boil down to roughly the same reduction percentage. Especially with early century Mexico, this is the case, which in turn reflects that the equity angle over here, or normative considerations, suddenly become less important. And for Mexico, yeah, if you go to 2 degrees or 1.5 degree, or if suddenly your non-CO2 reduction potential is way less than you expected, maybe, then all these reduction percentages for all the fairness rules shift up. And for early century China, this is not the case, because that's also an interesting case, because for them, specifically the year from which you start computing historical emissions matters a lot. Because if you go very far back in time, China had very few emissions. And then Europe and the US are the culprits, so to say. But if you only account for recent emissions, say from 1990 or even 2000 on, then China is penalized as much, just between brackets, as EU and the US. So these kind of things you can start detecting here. And that's sort of provide, we call it the paper Navigating the Black Box, because different articles in literature treat all of these parameters differently, which, as we show here, clearly yield different results. And that's what we try to navigate here. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you give an example of how countries are behaving based on where they are in this one?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
So let's see. So for example, India is getting only very high, fair shares, focusing on responsibility. Because if you look at equality and look at capability, with respect to the current pledges, they actually have to reduce a lot. So what you see partially in the rhetoric is the focus on historical emissions. And at the same time, apart from that discussion, you especially see that in the in fair shares later in the century, you see the narrative of focusing or of deviating from the 1.5 degree target and focusing on 2 degree would also be fine. And that is what you then also partially see here. So this duality in their results is maybe not something. Yes.
Shift a lot to the physical and social uncertainties, and especially in the climate sensitivity.
Yeah.
I was wondering if, especially over time, the countries that get affected a lot more by the climate change, that would also maybe shift the narrative in the country to reduce more. But that isn't that really shown in the data at all?
Okay, so that's a good point. So this focuses on what is determining the calculation of the fair share for mitigation of a country, which is of course a more narrow question than the broader question you're asking of what is determining a national priority, right? So indeed, if a country is affected by climate impacts a lot, then the national priority may shift more towards, hey, we want to combat that, or thinking in the direction of we want to be compensated for adaptation. So that can also have different outcomes. But that's outside of this question. Yeah. Yeah. So it's never also a one-to-one translation between what you see here and what the rhetoric is in international negotiations. Yes.
Sorry, I was wondering what exactly is on the on the y-axis
Here.
These different countries. Yeah. What is
Yeah.
100% what?
So I didn't talk about this yet. But very briefly then, this is basically the percentage of variance explained in the computations of the fair shares. So basically a magnitude for each of the factors. All the yellow, red shades are normative considerations. Blue shades are scientific uncertainties. And you see, especially because of slowly diverging population projections for some countries, especially India, the blue areas become larger in the second half of the century. And all the green shades are about these global discussions, like also the temperature goal. But it's all fractions of the total variance in the projections of the fair shares.
Is that you have to say it's your coordinates with the triangle?
Yes.
Yeah. It's another representation of the triangle, I guess, right? So.
Yeah. No, yeah, those are the coordinates for the triangle.
The total of the variations are these different allocations, or what is the total?
So you do fair share computations across many different parameter sets. So you get basically almost like a PDF of fair shares based on variations of many different, sampling of many different parameters across all these uncertainty dimensions.
Maybe that's the ranges showed in the previous slides.
Yeah. Not a one-to-one map, but yes. So you have a range of uncertainties of fair shares. And this is a subset, it doesn't matter. And then you try to infer what is determining this range. Is it mostly normative considerations? Is it mostly scientific uncertainties, or is it mostly these global strategies? And that's what we disentangle.
Okay, but if you are mostly varying the allocations, the allocation rule is not, it is not surprising that the allocation rule has the largest share.
In the start. No. Well, for some countries, this is not the case, like the case of Mexico and mid-century China, for example, or China in a couple tens of years. where these allocation rules boil down to the same number. But let's talk about this further in the coffee, because we have a lot of other things to chat about. And I knew this picture would require some explanation. Yeah. It's an important element because the literature on fair shares makes different choices in all of these dimensions. And this is, you want to get a grasp on this so that we are aware of that there are different choices and that they affect fair shares in a different way. Okay, so what we want to do now is you have all your laptops ready already, I see. To get a bit of a feeling for these numbers, if we have time, I'm looking at Mathijs. Yeah. Let's go to this website. Over here. And just for 5 minutes, compute fair shares for your own. And I have a screenshot here, so let me briefly, before you go, but you're already going, of course, I show what you can do here. So this is kind of the starting screen after you press Start Exploring. Here on the left, you have a couple of global settings that you can set. Do you want to reach 2 degrees with your calculation, or 1.5, or something in between? You have a couple of other settings, which then affect this green curve, which is your global emissions pathway. Yeah, you see it changing shape. And then you can, if you're satisfied with that, you can go to the world map and you see buttons on the bottom of different approaches to computing fair shares. And then you can even click on a country, for example, your home country, and then you can have a look at how this in more detail plays out. We're talking about, again, all greenhouse gases, including land use, which may be slightly different from how target setting is in your country, which could be focusing on without land use or CO2, etc. So keep that in mind. But yeah, have a go. Curious what you find. A little bit of a workshop setting. Yes.
Is this the model that you use to produce the data?
This is indeed a web tool we made on the paper of most of the results that you saw just now. The paper came out 3 weeks ago or so, so I guess you can look it up. I can also put it in the study materials. But yes, of course, it's kind of a subset because these settings are only settings at the global level. And we chose a couple of defaults for like these normative parameters, because otherwise you have, you know, a huge list of parameters. But yeah, just to give you a bit of a hint. Yeah.
We have a jump.
So that's the immediate per capita rule for one. We have per capita rule, which does start here, and then towards per capita allocation. This is the immediate one. There's something that Jan will also highlight later in this presentation, which is another consideration of itself.
The US, the spike bias is this. So that's if you don't need more. So even despite the fact that there's this radically that's the version.
Yeah, but that's not actually anyway, because yes, there's the was going grandfathering, but you also have an argument for solutions. Global things already things. For example, the reduction of non-CO2 emissions. That will be, I mean, we're varying that, but the variation will be relatively small from the 30 million. And that's the same with how the emissions pathway differs in 2030 already between the
it's a global solution. So think over it,
exactly. All the variation is smaller in some of
But basically what it does, it takes the total globe, then you apply the allocation,
Yeah. So basically, every year in this green pathway, you allocate. For some rules, you'll have to go via the main.
Maybe you should specify the 7 of what countries this pathway.
Yeah, so that's very constrained.
Yeah.
And somehow together adds up to a possibility. But what's behind is that you can actually vary some things. Well, reflecting typically global. Of course, you can later get
It's like not so much, and then you know the fact it's also great material.
But they're not used in the actual translations or because that's actually what you want to distinguish. All right, we stop now, and I want to have maybe a couple of reactions of what did you find? What did you find surprising? Maybe confirming? Yes, go. That they have a relatively higher historical responsibility, you mean? That they have to go down according to this rule? Interesting. Yeah. So then
I think it's massive fossil fuel production, and in general, the Eastern European countries that are from the Soviet bloc are a bit in contrast with the rest of the world in the sense that they have much higher historical emissions compared to financial capabilities. So they both emitted a lot and not on that rich. So if you usually for the US, you would find high correlation in both indices, etc. But if you look at Ukraine, massive historical emissions, those are get that really the industry is not efficient. Look at that.
interesting. Yeah.
I was just surprised you had a equal cumulative per capita, but not for a specific country, but like in general, it feels like almost the whole world is removing carbon for like India, Pakistan. I couldn't really grasp why.
So that's interesting. Huh? You phrase it as so there are two elements in this question. Let's go to this one first. You're phrasing it like is removing carbon. And exactly. So a negative allocation does not necessarily infer that domestically you are actually, removing that much of emissions. It's mostly a reflection of current emission. That's one element that Jan mentioned earlier in this presentation. But also, and we'll get to that in a minute, that it hints towards that this country has a responsibility to doing mitigation also elsewhere. Especially if it's so negative, it's not feasible to do that. But it's a reflection of you have a super high responsibility to pay for mitigation even beyond your borders if you cannot meet that amount of negative targets in your own country.
And India and Pakistan also have a big share of the global population, so and it's based on population projections as well.
Yeah, so equal cumulative per capita, it's kind of a proxy for historical responsibility, but it factors in that if you're a big country, then you are also allowed to emit a lot in the past. So that is factored in there.
Big country population.
Yes.
Like historical population cuts. So if you have a country which has like a population, would it then use the current population for the historical population, or would it use the changing over time population?
The latter. Yeah. So year to year, you check what is you as a country, your population fraction of the total, and what's your emission fraction of the total, and it compares them. And if you are emitting more than what would be back then, your per capita rightful amount of emissions, then you start building up that. That's the idea. Yeah. One other, Nadine.
Using those less stringent approaches, I don't know if you also show that the countries still manage to like keep the thing, or we don't meet the 130 gigatons of carbon targets.
Do you mean what if every country follows their least stringent?
Yes, those.
Let's go to this picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is a nice bridge. So what if we do that exercise? How far are we in time?
So we have, I would say we have 10 minutes left.
10 minutes. Okay. Should be. I'll be quick. I'll be quick.
We are super flexible because lunch is here today, and that's an hour. But the principal is here, so
okay.
But let's go for 10 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's do that exercise. Let's ask for every country out of the three principles: equality, responsibility, and capability, to do the least stringent for them. Right? The short answer to Najeli's question is, what happens then? Are you meeting your global target then? Are you remaining within your carbon budget? The answer is no. There's actually a pretty big gap already by 2030 of the order of magnitude of 10, 15 gigatons or so. So it's quite a lot. But let's do that and then compare the pledges, the NDCs of each of the countries to that least stringent target. So what if we do not, as a neutral researcher between brackets, do not take position in what to take out of these three, take the least stringent for a country and compare their pledge. That's what's shown here. In red, which is basically the whole global north and also a lot of countries here, is that in that sense, even if you take the least stringent, most NDCs are insufficient. Yes. Yes. And what? Yes. And what now if you do the same exercise, but then remember these use uncertainty bars, and then also take out of the uncertainty bars of these stringent, which involves 2 degrees instead of 1.5, which involves super optimistic non-CO2 projections, which involves populations projections that are such that you as a country are benefiting from the fair share calculation. So it's very far, but let's do that, and that's the right picture. And then you see that even then, some countries, especially in South America, but also Saudi Arabia and Russia, have insufficient NDCs. So this is out of the whole, labyrinth of uncertainty, still robust messages. And then going into what you were mentioning before, that maybe for some countries there are super negative targets, echoing the idea that these fair shares should not be taken as it used to be for domestic mitigation targets, but mostly to evaluate, how far off of fair are you, and also to inform potential international finance. And this is what we do very simplistically in this plot. You have reduction targets here. Say you have your NDC here, what is cost optimal in brown, And then the 3 allocation rules. So responsibility, capability in yellow, and in blue, equality. And then you can, if you look at the reduction targets, indicate that, well, if you have a fair target over here, what is cost optimal over here, and even further what you currently pledge, the no-brainer is that in the gray area, you should do domestic mitigation up to what is even cost optimal to do in your country. And then the difference between what is cost optimal in your fair share would be red, would be what you provide in terms of finance elsewhere. And similarly, you can have situations where from these calculations and comparing it to what is cost optimal from IAMs, indicating what would be, following this heuristic, a good amount of emissions that you would receive funding for to mitigate. And doing these calculations in light of time very, very quickly for countries, you see that here, US, Japan, EU, you see that the NDCs are roughly cost optimal, but the fair shares are going much deeper, indicating that it would be wise to at least start talking about international finance to financing mitigation elsewhere. For some countries, the pledges are simply very weak. So there's a long bridge to take to even become cost optimal in these countries, so to enforce or go for mitigation domestically more. And then you also have countries where you can identify basically emission spaces or emission amounts that would be provided in terms of finance from others. Okay, let's wrap up.
I'll try to be quick. I wanted to show some of the limitations that other focus on some research. Maybe one of the big modeling choices that influenced the results, all of the results that we saw, was how do you translate the allocation rule of like a cumulative emissions budget or like capability into an emissions allocation formula, and how do you distribute the effort over time? Because you could argue, well, if you have a negative budget, you should have negative emissions immediately, or you can still emit for some time, but then you have more negative emissions or allocation in the future. So there's a bit the question of how do you translate this allocation rule into really a formula? And so far, a lot or nearly all of the literature was doing emissions trajectories that start from the current emission level and then behave whichever way they should. But there was this anchoring point, which isn't really a legal requirement, but it was just common practice, probably coming from the fact that originally it was supposed to inform domestic emissions reduction and not necessarily with trading. But as we go on time and don't meet our fair share and update those allocations or rerun the emissions allocation, then just because we start from a later starting point, it closes the ambition gap. So there's an effect of shifting goalposts, and that rewards sort of inaction. And that's also in generally speaking, this grandfathering effect, so the fact that you have some rights to emit more just because your emissions are very high, for some time was criticized as incompatible with international law and unfair. And so one option would be to allocate emissions reduction that are drastically lower immediately. And there was one option on immediate equal per capita in the tool that you saw. So there's a bit this issue that is being tackled, this grandfathering effect in the literature. And so this is from an article that is not published, it's under review. We did it with Mark, and that was used by a group of 70 and commissioned actually by a group of 70 vulnerable countries. And they were using this to really try to show that this issue with shifting goalposts and rewarding inaction over and over again was detrimental to them. And so this was an ambition assessment trying to see whether the countries' national pledges, the ones that Mark mentioned, were or not in adequacy with the emissions allocations that we had derived. So there's this tool as well online. So here you can really see like emissions allocation that are really discontinuous. And as Mark mentioned, that means a lot of finance and immediately to also fund emissions reduction in the global south. So there's also the question, yeah, how do we do with the fact that, how do we do when we have a 1.5 degree budget? So we're already in breach of the global carbon budget. So how do we account for this? So there was this paper that we mentioned from Pelt et al. Looking at, should we start to put a tab and to really try to account for the carbon debt that is being accumulated? But one of the, I mean, it's good, but one of the issue with this is that it leaves a little bit of carte blanche on the near term. So maybe approaches like this can also try to highlight how it's not just about accumulating debt for the future, but also having immediate responsibility to do more. The other issue was, how do you combine principles? So Mark showed a range. You can do an average. You can use some numerical tools, but what does that mean, philosophically speaking, to average responsibility with capability? So there are different approaches, but all that to say that it's not a set debate. Some are using numerical tools, some are suggesting sort of conceptual allocation. There was the question of what happens if each country chooses the method that is the least stringent. So we did this in a paper a while back, and we found that if then we all aim at, the world aims at 2 degrees, but follows that sort of self-interested approach of picking least stringent emission allocation, then we go to 2.5, and if we aim for 1.5, we get to 2. And interestingly, the sum of countries' pledges was sort of in line with that self-interested narrative. Yeah, so I think that's it, and then maybe just linking with the fact that how it is used, some governments use it. So the Committee on Climate Change, which is an independent scientific advisory body to the UK, used one of our study to justify or recommend the emissions targets for the UK, which is also being legally challenged. And I'm also asked to criticize whether or not that was well used and interpreted. There's also the European Scientific Advisory Board that highlighted that the debt of the EU is so high that the EU has to have the highest possible ambition domestically, which is 90 to 95% emissions reduction, and in addition needs to provide funding to fund emissions reduction overseas. So then there will be the question, we'll work on it on Friday, of how this kind of literature is used for court cases as well. Also for doing the same purpose, assessing the ambition and the sufficiency of emissions pledges, but it's used and understood slightly differently when you work within the frame of what a court can do, which is different from what a decision maker can do. And I think this is the last point for you.
Maybe just one final point. We are here at the Summer School of Equity and Impacts. And actually in this presentation, we're only talking about mitigation, not talking about impacts. And there was actually a question just now on this. This is maybe also a big limitation of this work. It's focusing on mitigation targets based on all kinds of factors, but not necessarily to what extent countries are impacted by climate change. So I would also see this as kind of an innovation, or maybe even the future of this type of work, because for many countries, their mitigation target or their NDC pledge even formally is conditional to certain economic growth or limits to damages. So this is maybe one final point to throw out in this thematic summer school. Okay, that's it. Thanks.
So I'd like to say a few things. First of all, I'm going to repeat what I said yesterday. We're really looking at the state of the art, I think, research in terms of, burden sharing research and fair shares research. So I think, we have to be honored that you both here, and I really loved the presentation. I have to be honest that I didn't read the paper yet. So this was actually, for me, also very informative. Another question maybe to Marina also is is it okay if we start 15 minutes later? Because we have lunch here, and then it's instead of an hour, it's 45 minutes, or we'll shift a little bit. Is that okay? So I think we can have a few questions. Maybe one last thing is, because after this we have the break. Now finally it's turning into a real summer school because the weather is now amazing. I would really recommend taking a coffee after this and then go outside and then enjoy the nice weather. But yeah, let's have a few questions and then chill, relax, and discuss further. Yeah. So really pressing questions for now, and then further discussions here. Maybe last question to you. I don't know how long you're
I will
today.
stay for at least a large part of today.
Yeah.
So also
It's all fine, but that's great because I think Mark can help with so many things actually related to all of the summer school. Because yeah, like you said yourself, you're also an expert in impacts and also in even graphs and everything. So basically everything here. So okay, so question. Start here.
Using emission budgets, you do not have really, you won't have any uncertainties about the, for example, like the negative limitations or the peak temperature. So I was wondering what makes you do that.
Yeah. So I guess the short answer is I don't see any of them much better than the other. So I see both have a different focus and advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of using a trajectory-based analysis is that you can directly infer the consequences of your computations for the years 2030 and 2035. That then would add up to a global pathway. So what is commonly done in a budget-based approach is that you allocate budgets to countries, obviously. So say country A has a budget of so many megatons. And then what you could do is to, if you want to relay that to use or relay that to an NDC target, for example, which is about a year rather than something cumulative. For example, the year 2030 or 2035, they draw kind of a linear line using that budget so that the area under the curve is kind of matching the budget, which is fine. But the disadvantage of that is that all these linear lines do not necessarily add up to what is perceived as a globally cost optimal pathway in terms of a convex shape.
But if I can very shortly, the physical budget, I think the limitation is that it's no longer feasible to stay collectively underneath it, especially if it becomes zero, right? So it will have to be an overshoot, and that's what the IAMs provide. It's a vision of how the world can do it. So I think using physical budget, it's good to establish ratio to purely look at responsibility. But if the goal is to either suggest collectively feasible targets, or to assess whether a target and an NDC is sufficient under a collective sort of trajectory, then using an IAM or some global scenarios is more adequate. And in the budget that Mark used, you use a budget, but based on trajectory, implementable trajectory.
Yeah, they intermingle a little bit in practice, actually, in methods. But again, they both have their place, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So Article 6 for everyone is an article on the Paris Agreement that basically sets rules as to how much you can share the funding. So how much a country can benefit for funding emissions reduction in another country. And so there's an agreement to avoid double counting. So if like the Netherlands funds emissions reduction in Ghana and they both agree, then the emissions reduction would count for the Netherlands. The thing is, the rules under Article 6 are about avoided emissions. So it's compared to some form of baseline. So it's a sort of needs-based approach. And that's not what we do when we do emissions allocation. So in those emissions allocation, it's possible for Nigeria or for very poor countries that the emissions allocation is greater than even a business as usual trajectory. And so in this case, using Article 6 might not add up. So the emissions trading that you could do under the fair share allocation, such as this article, what Mark provided, might exceed the actual physical possible emissions reduction under Article 6. So there is a discussion, like basically for a developing country, the emission allocation is like really high in the near term. But by having an emissions target that's already within it, so the 1.5 degree aligned country, in theory, they already forfeited their rights to a great emission space because that's already what they committed to, and they have to, their next target has to be an improvement. And so that's also what they voiced, the countries that we worked with, these countries, the Climate Vulnerable Forum, they phrased it this way. They said, look, we're already giving a lot of emission space, for sacrificing it, and then to do even more, we would need finance. So that's how they phrase it.
So I would say one last pressing question is if there is any, one plenary question, but otherwise, I mean, you're here, so.
There's one question.
Yeah. So.
I was wondering how to use, like, for example, emissions from global transport and some things, which are really hard to allocate to companies.
I mean, in these calculations, we do not specify where the emissions should come from. So we are actually not dealing with these complexities, which are very real, of course, at all.
We're removing emissions from international bunkers. That is,
We do that, yeah.
Shipping, international shipping, and international aviation, because they are currently not being allocated to any countries, and they don't fall under any of the pledges. So they have their own separate accounting, and because most of these works try to inform UNFCCC discussions, then it follows the same. And it's also territorial emissions. So same accounting as the UN.
Yeah, so we do incorporate them to add up to the globe, that we not, because of that, exceed the budgets or the climate targets, but we do not allocate them. No. Yeah.
So thanks again, Jan and Mark, for yeah, let's grab a coffee or tea and or whatever, and then again, I will sort of go outside and stretch my legs. We'll see each other then at 11:45 here. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
This one?
yeah.
I know this doesn't work.
Oh, there's more.
I just need, yeah.
It's the
This is PC, right?
And then, of course,
No worries. You can sit there, please.
So let's continue. We have 1 hour before lunch with some, I'm assuming, and pretty sure, very interesting work from Marina again. It fits well in our very gender unequal summer school we have. That's a positive thing, the way I see it. But yeah, this is then related to climate, of course, and there might be some technical aspects or general aspects that might be useful also to understand for you in general.
I
Are
just need
you
a
okay?
bit of, like now I need to swap screens, but where do I do? Oh, like this? Oh yeah,
Yeah.
okay, perfect.
Perfect. Then floor is yours.
Okay, as you can see, I'm in charge of different topics at this summer school: adaptation, gender equality. But I think as it's come up in multiple discussions, both quite central. And personally, this nexus of gender inequality and climate has become probably my favorite area of work over the past years. So I'm super happy to actually be talking to you about it. The presentation today will go a bit beyond of just climate change and gender to kind of arrive there through understanding a bit of a broader context for societal consequences of gender inequality, what drives it, what happens there, to then arrive to potentially how we could integrate considerations of gender equality in the scenario space itself. And then what implications does this have for our understanding of challenges to both mitigation and adaptation? But before that, I thought it's useful to get us all on the same page with some key terms, which I'm sure all of you know, but never hurts to kind of still remind ourselves of this, that when we talk about sex or male and female, this is the biological characteristics associated with the categories that that you know. And then gender is more about the cultural characteristics are attributable with being a certain gender. And as you all know, this is a rather expansive concept, even though what I'll be presenting today, I'll mostly be talking about differences between men and women, even though we know that it's much more colorful than that, not least because this is what we get from data. This is how we collect data. And although it's probably changing, now, if we want to look at some historical overview, this is typically the differences that we get. Now, I want to talk about two things that I'm not sure have come up so much in throughout this week. So the difference between equity and equality. On my title slide, I had gender equality, and this is often what you hear. You hear about the Gender Equality Index, you hear about the Gender Equality SDG, and so on. But what is the difference actually between equity and equality? And I have the definitions here, but I wonder if anyone's actually thought of this since Monday or before, if there's a difference and why does it matter? Yeah, well, both of you.
Everybody. And equity would be divide the cake based on who wants to eat more or who is more hungry. Like
yeah, yeah. I think that's a good example. Did you want to add more or less? Yeah, I mean, when we talk about gender equality and measuring it, it's often representational. So it's often really that we're talking about equality. We're talking about difference in labor force participation between men and women. We're talking about differences in education, about the gender pay gap. We're talking about
differences in life expectancy. All of these things are basically talking about equality. But to get to situations of equity, where we've created environments where individuals are recognized for their circumstances and needs, it's a slightly different story. So I think I'll be talking mostly about gender equality today, but I think it would be useful for us, especially later, maybe when we also have a little exercise to think about how is gender equity different from gender equality? And because everyone likes this buzzword empowerment, and I sometimes hear about people talking about female empowerment or women's empowerment, also in the context of gender equality. This is the process of promoting the discriminated against gender by identifying and redressing some power imbalances. And I really like this this visualization of equity and equality. I think the cake example was great. There are many different ways to visualize it, but basically here you see it. That's equality. Everyone was given a box, but in an equitable way, everyone was actually adjusted to their specific needs. And then a definition of inequality. I guess there are many different ways to talk about it, but it's an outcome of different expectations, of different socio-cultural roles, values, and it leads to a swathe of different inequalities and uneven accesses here to power, opportunities, and resources. And these three power, opportunities, and resources is something that I think we can link very strongly to how we think about climate action, both from adaptive capacity, so what I was talking about yesterday, but also capacity to mitigate, and something that will come later. So what does gender inequality look around the world? There are many different ways to measure it. This is an index from the United Nations Development Program. It's basically the further you go towards the one, the worse it looks. And how is this map measured? What's behind it? It's this index. So basically it's a little bit, could maybe a little bit remind you of the Human Development Index, but it has some notable differences, especially in this empowerment part. So I want to already challenge here the equality notion. So we said equality is when we give the same, when different people can achieve the same thing or are given the same thing. And here we have the health component, which looks at the maternal mortality ratio and adolescent birth rate, so teenage pregnancies, as sort of an index of female reproductive health. But this is not really equality. Like, there are no male equivalents to maternal mortality ratio or teenage pregnancies. So even people who thought about how to quantify gender inequality came up with a funny way to measure equality. So I think this is extremely important. This tells us so much about the state of the health system, about the state of society overall. We can do so much by understanding maternal mortality. So I think it's great that it's in this index, actually, because it's very informative, but I'm not sure it really tells us about equality per se. But nevertheless, other components of the index look at female labor force participation, female and male shares in parliaments, and female and male population with at least secondary education. This is how, most indices look like. So basically they look at the differences in some participation or in some outcome or in education. But actually I wanted to show you quite an innovative index from the EU. So the EU has an institute on gender equality and they derive their own index. And unfortunately, it's only for the EU countries, so we can't have a nice global comparison. But the EU has collected quite a bit of data on the many different societal dimensions that would shape gender inequality. And I want to show, I just want to get there. Some innovations that they've introduced. So you have these classical indicators of employment, where, as you can see, just there are more employed men than women, and then that's what you'll repeatedly see. But when it comes to education, actually, we have more now more women as graduates of tertiary education, and actually as participating in even non-formal educations and training by a slight margin, but still. But then this is a very interesting part that we don't have in other indices. So how we use time. Like, you'll probably know that this is really difficult to quantify. This is something that doesn't go into our GDP. We could now start a whole new discussion about time use, about contribution of unpaid labor to economic activities and so on. But basically here, this is quite nice that they showed what a disparity we have in between men and women in basically taking care, doing the care duties and doing housework. Funnily enough, when it comes to social activities, the difference is not as stark, but men do more social activities than women, and that's probably quite correlated. So this is probably an outcome of a time use survey. You get to these types of results. I want to introduce here another term, probably something also that many of you are familiar with, which is the idea of intersectionality, meaning that different sources of. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, one question to these indices. And especially there is also indicators measuring gender equality, the SDGs.
Mm-hmm.
And they are very difficult to relate to model variables, like crimes against women and so on. Yeah, so very serious stuff, but difficult to model. The stuff that you just had.
Is it difficult to model? How many femicides did Germany have in the past year?
Yeah.
124.
Wow.
I noticed this recently in the news, so that's why I thought about it.
And the ones that you had on the slide that make up this indicator.
Yeah.
They are much. I think it was the one before. Yeah, this one. Did you actually relate this to the projections also of the SSPs, because these variables, the indicators, they can be derived or related to the SSPs.
Yeah, we have a paper from 2020, Nature Communications, projections of the Gender Inequality Index.
And does it make a good difference?
SSPs. Yeah. I'll show this in a little bit. Good point. I think I maybe should have also put the SDG indicators. I do have one slide showing we're totally not on track. But I want to come back to this idea, which is the whole separate discussion. I think it's nevertheless important to introduce, because these sources of discrimination, of inequalities, compound. I don't know if we can quantify the ways in which they compound, but basically the interaction of multiple forms of discrimination makes things even worse. So I don't now need to put illustrative examples here, but the important point is that these different layers, especially when they come from positions of inequality, create very unique experiences of either privilege or oppression. And in a very basic way, this EU index wanted to start looking into this. So when we talk about graduates of tertiary education, earlier you saw how for both of these classes of education, there are more women than men in percentage-wise. But when you look at disabilities as another factor that leads to inequality. Actually, there are more, well, there are first of all way fewer people in general, but then there are more men than women with disabilities who obtain tertiary education. So you see how this graph flips. So that's just highlighting how to really get a good overview of all the sources of inequality that people face. You need to look into this more. They did this also for breaking this data down by basically people's origin of birth. And there they don't see that this pattern flips. So it holds that still women tend to have a little bit more education than men. Another way that one could look at this is to talk about employment. There were always more men and women, but if you look one step beyond of who are the employed people, what is their family status? So if they're single, a lone parent, or a couple without children, these statistics change quite a bit. So again, individual circumstances matter. I think this is sort of a state of the art index. The EU, I think, has really made an effort to collect this data over the past years to understand this in a bit more complex way. But I'll stop there more or less for the indices part. And I actually want to ask you now, based on this little bit that you saw and obviously what you know, how many countries have actually achieved gender equality? Any guesses?
Doesn't exist.
No, it's zero. So if you look at just like this one index, perhaps this is the very slow moving process. That's how the world in general fared on this gender inequality index. I've here put a few countries that, so that's Bosnia, that's where I'm from, which is an interesting story of itself, which here looks like it's done okay. But Bosnia has a communist past, and actually before the 90s, women did much better than they do now in terms of economic and societal empowerment, but that's something that these indices can't necessarily capture.
This one.
The best country, Denmark, Sweden.
Yeah.
Other stories behind the big jumps, or is that?
Yeah, so think Afghanistan, Iran, like I think these can sometimes be explained by sort of either political shifts, regime shifts that either launched women into a much better or a much worse situation, depending on what you look at. What Nico mentioned, did you want to ask him? Huh? I know. Yeah, there's an SDG on gender equality, which also collects the data and tracks how well we're doing. Not on track to achieve it, never mind, but we could hypothesize on when could we reach gender equality, at least as measured by these indicators. So you saw the trend line and some quick extrapolation. The World Economic Forum did it, and this is what they came up with. I think, yeah, we're all work with data, we're scientists, we could probably challenge the statement, what does this even mean? But I think it still drives home the message that this is a very slow process and it might take a long time until we're there without targeted policies. So another important bit. Nico, that's for you. So based on this gender inequality index that I showed earlier, this actually nicely maps to what we have available in the SSPs. So we were actually, this is a bit annoying.
Move it to the sides.
Able to actually do projections, where you see, what you see quickly from this map is that in SSP3, things more or less stay the same as in 2017. This was the latest data when we wrote the paper. But already by 2050, there would be opportunities for substantial improvement, both in SSP2 and 1, especially if we look at these indicators. And this could be particularly, I think there's an interesting story emerging in this additionally. So that's for the near term. And we just here split population to like girls and women to look at the different age group, because there's a demographic component in this story. So countries that are currently most affected by low levels of gender equality are also countries that tend to still be growing rapidly in population, and they tend to be quite young populations. So what happens here by 2030 is that there will be a lot more women in countries that are currently affected by gender inequality. So unless we make progress on it, it could be that up to 55% of women or 75% of girls, because they're younger and younger societies, remain affected by gender inequality. But in an SSP2 and SSP1 world, so worlds of either moderate or rapid fertility decline, and what is fertility decline powered by? Women's education. Actually achieve much better results. And this is something we know how to do. We know how to build schools, but we know how to educate teachers, but we need to keep girls in school. And a whole that's even built in the SSPs, the power of female education to drive demographic change, which in turn, at least in our SSPs, drives everything else. Yeah.
Just a remark on the SSP demographics and the education. And these scenarios don't include adult education. So you could speed up the process to reach gender equality and also overall increase education levels if you would introduce the scenarios of policy for adult educations.
What does that mean? Like different from university education, or?
No, not university, but also the primary, secondary schooling, which is important here also.
But what do you mean they don't include it?
In the scenarios, the attainment of education levels is restricted to only during your youth, so to say. In the SSPs, there is no adult education.
To receive education later in life.
Therefore, there is a possibility to speed that up.
But you do have the measure of mean years of schooling, which don't restrict as to when you got education.
So to say, the people in
who get it
are not educated as soon as they become adults.
Yeah, that's
this
very
can often be a very successful strategy to improve the situation.
Interesting. Yeah, I think this could be an interesting thing to model. Yeah. Anyway, this is already a few years old. So this was basically just an internally consistent extrapolation in the SSPs to show what possible trajectories of gender inequality we could expect. But we could definitely criticize this and expand this work. And what I'm actually interested in is how could this be endogenized in socioeconomic processes? So a little bit in the direction of what Nico is saying, how do we actually see these effects in GDP, in life expectancy, beyond? So currently in the SSPs, women's education reduces fertility, but that's about it. But based on what I'm hoping to show now, I think there are broader implications for the society, for economy, and finally for climate. You might recognize this woman. We spoke about one influential Nobel Prize winner over the past days, but I'm a big fangirl of this woman who received the 2023 Nobel Prize for Economics, the first woman to achieve the prize individually. And basically this was her life's work, was looking at gender pay gap, was looking at historical evolution of women in the labor force, and how does this actually translate to being an economic force? I here put the link of her, of the lecture she gave when she received the prize, but I'll put some of the highlights that I found very interesting. I also took them from her presentation.
Ironic that she works on gender equality and then first person who
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Well, there was this couple who got the Nobel Prize, Esther Duflo and her husband, Battery. But she, individually. But yeah. So basically, this is quite interesting that throughout history, women's participation in labor force has had a bit of a U-shape. And what you see here is that when production of goods, services was contained to home, women worked. So agriculture, when agricultural production was contained to home, women were high participants, or married women were highly participating in the labor force. But with the onset of industrialization and moving work outside of home, this is slowly reduced. Yeah.
Is this the whole world, or is it Western societies?
I actually don't know. I don't know how much data she would have for the whole world. I imagine it's quite West focused.
Probably US.
And basically, you also then see a shift that's due to different factors, including she had this pioneering work showing the power of the contraceptive pill, what this did for women's empowerment, and eventually more and more contribution to the labor market to come back to these previous levels and be roughly still not at I think currently it's about 50 or 60% globally. However, I forgot about this animation. However, there's still globally quite some difference in how this looks. So basically now this is relating women's participation in employment with GDP. And you're meant to see a bit of a U-shaped curve emerging here as well, which would substantiate some of these arguments made earlier. But basically, this is problematic. So this bit are the many countries where basically that from their GDP should have been on a much higher level of employment, but due to various factors, including a lot of stigma of women's participation in the labor market, there are barriers to basically move this further up here. Nico, you were.
What do you think about
in education, the story is quite different. Here you see a very continuous trend of increasing women in college graduation rates, and I think this is only for the US, and including this point that happens around 1980, where women overtake men in the share of college graduates. And actually right now, across OECD, all OECD countries, this is something that holds. So that's another, speaking of data visualization, Kai, it's a super simple graph that that's quite powerful.
Now this room, quite awesome.
Yeah, I guess we would, yeah. This I'll skip in the interest of time. Basically, there's an idea that you have this data, so participation in labor force, this education, this means there's a lot of human capital that's not perhaps in employment. And there's been this study by McKinsey whose methodology I think has been a little bit questioned, but they arrived to this figure that gender inequality is a cost to a society, and that actually getting to equality would add up to 28 trillion to global GDP. I've
How exactly?
I'm not actually sure. So it's like the model is somewhere in the appendix. It's really like a set of equations that are kind of like meh. But I was actually curious about this before I came even across this OECD paper. Basically, I was curious if one could somehow understand whether you can actually show the mechanisms behind this potential effect. But before that, I want to break this little bit down. So we saw now this graph in all OECD countries, women are have more education than men in tertiary education. That's the top line. But basically, if you want to look at scientific work, women in science, this immediately changes. So share of women who are researchers is at some stable 40% over the past 30 years. Share of women STEM graduates also far lower than the actual share of higher education. And then what I was interested in is share of inventors, so people sort of at the forefront of our R&D. And then that share is even like a little bit increasing, but even lower. This is called the leaky pipeline phenomenon. So that women fall through the cracks of the system somehow. So even if they do have more higher education on paper or outnumber men, actually, when you go, whatever you want to call this, maybe like up this pyramid of scientific work or something, women systematically drop out. And there are many reasons for this that I don't need to explain to you, of course, and they tie into the things that we looked at before, but nevertheless are quite striking. In this piece of work, I was particularly interested in whether we could look at environmental patterns. So coming back to the story of inventors, and whether we can actually see if there is maybe a gradient of women in environmental technologies and whether they would help innovation, especially there. And I guess this is the COVID effect here, what you see. But basically, this share has been steadily increasing, which I found quite an interesting observation. So I took this data for patents, and I was wondering if I can show with some econometric methods, because I had historical data, if innovation increases with gender equal research, because plainly speaking, you would have your best brains on the job if you have gender equality in whatever setting. And that's indeed true. So here I show quite simply that a 5 percentage point increase in the share of female researchers leads to 6 more patents per capita. So that's based on global data. And this also is observed specifically in environmental patterns. I've controlled for quite a few indicators that you would want to rule out that are driving these results, and this holds across the board. Please on site still haven't submitted the manuscript. Sometimes the effect for selection of countries also appears to be stronger than GDP. So I thought this was a brilliant idea that I had, that I showed this only to then learn that this is a really old idea, that one of sort of the grandfathers of economic thought, anyone who studied economics has come across John Stuart Mill, so sort of the father of utilitarian theory, turns out had a wife who was a great thinker, and after her death, he published this book on the subjection of women, where basically they argued, so this was the collection of their conversations and some scholarly work as well. So this was the 19th century, and they argued that gender equality is a relic of the past. So how could we why do we even talk about it? And basically I put this citation here that I don't need to read, I'll just let you read. So basically this part in bold the ideas and potential of half of the population would be liberated, producing a great effect on human development that McKinsey quantified at $29 trillion. And I'll finish this part now on an anecdote that apparently is it was an ethnographic research, basically looking at the time of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. Apparently, the Americans got really worried when they realized that in the Soviet Union, there are like all of these women mathematicians, not because they were women, but because they had double brain power. So in 1963, they passed something called the Defense Education Act in the US. So this was part of the space program that was specifically targeting expansion of women into STEM education, because they realized this could maybe help them advance the science a little further. And indeed, Soviets did manage to send the first woman in space, and this was in 1993. This lady here went on a first ever solo mission. I'll end here, and actually, if there are no questions, move a little bit to what I see as implications of this for climate change, and come back to our beloved SSP pathway. So a lot of what I'll show now, I mean, has already come through. Basically, the gender inequality has implications both for challenges for mitigation and for adaptation. And here is now a collection of insights we have from the literature already on this. So basically, what I was saying yesterday, because of a lack of access to resources, so how we also measure gender equality, there could be lower adaptive capacity, therefore lower vulnerability to climate extremes. One of you mentioned yesterday this disproportional effect on women that stems from, again, gender norms, so responsibility for securing fuel or water. There was a recent paper by PIC colleagues, by Leonie and Max, on basically the time spent fetching water and how this will increase with climate change, and therefore not only place an additional burden, but also take time from other activities like going to school, or that would be more productive. Because of specific hygienic needs, women are more susceptible to water-related infections. So again, additional vulnerability to climate impacts. And for some regions, could even be, so in like a survival situation, floods, running away from something, could even be prevented by either not being taught how to swim or by getting entangled in traditional clothing or stuff. There are studies that go as far as to show even this. So that's just to say there are really myriad of connections. There's also what happens in the aftermath of climate extremes. So before it was sort of during, and then there's what happens after. So because of different strains on the livelihood, uncertainty, and the rest, there's evidence for increased exposure to gender-based domestic violence. There's an increased likelihood of early marriage. This could be interpreted as an insurance not policy, like an insurance intervention, that girls are married off early. And definitely there's an increased likelihood to interrupt or end schooling, which, as we talked earlier, can have these domino effects, not just for an individual, but for a society as a whole. It's not always women that are disproportionately affected. So I think all of you who've studied climate impacts on labor will know that exposure in the building sector is something that would particularly affect men. In global statistics, men are also more likely to die, so be fatalities in floods and storms. That's just what numbers show. And in situations of droughts, there have been a couple of studies in India that I also know have been a bit challenged, but I put it here nevertheless, that men tend to be more likely die of suicide or experience depression coming from effects on livelihood, also including during droughts. That's sort of an Do you want to add something? Now, the other axis of the SSPs is mitigation challenges, and maybe more relevant to some of your work here. So first, we talk about institutions and decision making. Could think of them as enablers or barriers to climate mitigation. Here we have studies showing that higher shares of women in parliament connect to more stringent climate policy. Now, this is something that we could challenge in different grounds, including that countries that have more gender equality are probably more progressive on everything else, including on climate. So I think there is space to disentangle these effects, but it's nevertheless something that's observed. And then on a more micro level, not micro level, but at a different level of governance, you see that in areas where there are more female bureaucrats, that actually they tend to do more green procurement, so that public procurement tends to be more sustainable or more green.
Maybe one question here.
Mm-hmm.
So what is cause and effect here? I mean, I could imagine there's a country where they are progressive and hopefully do something climate, but also focus on women empowerment. So I mean, is the women that are causing like better green policies, or
no? So I'm always reluctant to draw this conclusion from this, and I hope that none of you takes away from my presentation either that it's something about women. I believe that these effects come from something about societies that are gender equal, that those societies maybe care about everything a bit more because they share care. That would be my number one characteristic of a gender equal society, is shared care. And through the shared care, that perhaps you also share more care about the environment and climate and a bit more responsibility. So
it could be both, by the way. I think this in any case, true.
Yeah.
Yes, but could also be that the women just are better for the world.
Yeah. So I'll come to this in a second. Just let me cover this. So strengthening of the human capital. I mean, you saw what I showed earlier. So higher innovative potential, higher labor force available for the green transition. We no longer need people to mine coal. We need people to install solar panels. Women can totally do this. So I think we need a bit of a paradigm shift for how we think about jobs as part of the energy transition. Though a flip side here, which is rightly pointed out, is that we ask, okay, with all of this high educated labor force and participants to the labor market, people have more money, so do they actually consume more and create more emissions? So in some cost benefit analysis, you could actually derive a conclusion that maybe women are bad for emissions because they give this, contribute this additional bit. And then there's behavioral change. So I think this is where maybe these questions of individuals' attitudes and behaviors are particularly visible. And there have been studies, including a recent one in France, based on a survey showing that women make greener consumer choices than men. They eat less meat. They drive apparently fewer cars. Maybe it's just my personal skepticism. I've never really reviewed these studies to really say something about their robustness, but I was always wondering, where does this come from? So do women drive less car because of their environmental convictions, or because the man takes car to work? Or because they're poorer, so they take public transport, they maybe don't have a car. Same for eating, for dietary habits. So I think it's a very valid question to ask. What would be the behavioral patterns in a gender equal world? So do we all eat a bit less meat, or do we all eat more meat because we all have more money and so we care kind of a bit less? So I think, I'm not so sure. I think it's still an open question, and it's difficult to do research in this field because we don't have the counterfactual of the world of gender equality. We haven't observed it, so we don't really know. But nevertheless, it affects both challenges for adaptation and for mitigation. And this brings me to almost the end, but basically what I just said, it's still a hypothetical world. but I like scenarios also for the reason that they could help us imagine this world. So now I wanted to ask you for just 2 minutes to turn to to the person sitting next to you, and for either one of the SSPs, if you could think of a picture that would describe the state of gender equality in one of the SSPs, to tell me what this picture would be. So choose either, it doesn't matter. And just describe, we're in 2050, how would you visualize gender equality in either of these? Just spend 2 minutes discussing this. We can just.
Okay.
We can.
Visualize it.
How to visualize?
For inspiration.
What picture would you? Which picture? Okay, let's move on. I know you're all also hungry. You can keep discussing this over lunch. But would someone volunteer? Has someone come up with an image or an illustration for one of the SSPs? Maybe it was also like, I know I put you a little bit on the spot. I was hoping we'd spend some time doing this, but we don't have that time. Anyone, you guys have something?
It still knows.
You did like an AI. Yeah.
We'll show it when it's ready.
Anyone else? Yeah, do you have something?
So we have to think about we don't really have a picture, but we hadn't thought about like maybe that's divided in the middle. So on one side would be very equal society, but some manage to, with a lot of resources to actually achieve the equality. But then also the countries that don't have that many resources to bridge the adaptation as well.
Yeah.
And the societies become even more unequal.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I thought about this. So I also spent some time thinking about how I would represent this. So does anyone have SSP 1? 2? Continuation of current trends? 3? Yeah?
Yes, so we thought about regional rivalries and more defense budgets and just disruptions of social life and that being taken away from education.
Uh-huh.
And as an image, we thought about a schoolyard that's not being used by the school children, but by the militaries for lack of space.
Interesting. Okay. I like that. Yeah. Do you have something?
I don't know if it's a shared idea. We also picked up this in SSP3. And the only image that came to my mind is, I don't know if you saw the Android scale. Graphics did it.
You have to say, yeah.
I think that the long-term scenario, the SSP3 could bring to, according to gender equality and inequalities, the results that's made since counterintuitive now. Like, I could possibly imagine countries like China more gender equal than countries like the US or Europe. So we have this idea of gender equality, like it's a goal that has to be followed per se, which is good. And I think we can also agree on that, but that's not the reality of many cultural heritages.
Yeah.
And if we look at what's happening now, and it's not now in these days, it's like a trend. I'm not so sure that the standards that we are speaking about and we kind of built with the globalization of the UN will be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we didn't even get there, you know, like we talked about this, very much as a normative goal that, well, we probably all here agree on, but yes, the fact is that we are seeing backsliding in women's rights and gender equality around the world, not just in Afghanistan, but also in the US. It's a valid question of where we will be in a couple of years. Okay, what did you come on?
You want to say something?
Yeah. So it's for SSP5, and we asked him to make to visualize the main characteristics of SSP5 and of gender equality. And you can imagine that it goes completely out of hand. And so one thing that's so you've got of course your woman in your female innovators and the researchers, the president. You've got the man is the dad, and the mom is now a robot. and there's a dynamic future. So that's what it made. Yeah, I don't know. But it looks very much SSP5 like, right?
Also, like with these what is DALI or what is it?
Yes, it's ChatGPT.
Okay, share the. Right. Share the picture in the.
Okay, we also discussed SB5, and at first I thought as the AI. Then we were discussing about sustainability and what you mentioned about like climate change, environmental awareness, and then like so women and all of this. So we don't agree with the AI now, and then she convinced me because it's like, as you said, like quite connected, and in SB5 we don't have that.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
cool.
yeah.
But you don't have a picture, you just talked about.
No, just discussed.
Cool. Yeah, funny. So very similar to what I had, I'll show you now. Yeah. So this is my SSP2 continuation of the current trend with what we saw at COP29. Basically, they do this family picture of group leaders. There are 133 world leaders in this picture, and 15 are women out of 133. So that's SSP2. That's how I imagined SSP1, basically, so that we're sharing care much more, but also that there are largely no barriers for women in science, including in like top scientific fields. These are, by the way, all real pictures. They weren't AI generated. I think this was I'm a bit, pre-AI maybe. That's how I imagine the SSP5. So actually that equality looks a bit different in SSP5 than 1, but that women still continue to do a big share of care work, but then they all drive huge SUVs. Perhaps this could come close to the SSP4. So I thought it will work for some women. So this is this iconic Spanish PM who brought baby and the first woman to bring the baby into the EU Parliament. So for some women, it works, but for others, it very much doesn't. And I had the same for SSP3. So I thought maybe it's a bit extreme, but Handmaid's Tale, I thought also could be a dystopian scenario. Though maybe I would revise it now a little bit, fearing that we are on an SSP3 trajectory. We can finish here, but I will also just show a little bit from our most recent paper, basically trying to invite the scenario community to rethink a little bit the SSP's challenges space based on everything that we talked about today. So basically, if these are the 3 key drivers of the SSPs, how would it look like if we would endogenize gender equality into the key drivers? So we now, the full line is what's already formalized in models. So gender equality in education affects population through fertility. It affects GDP a little bit through simply a higher human capital, but it still doesn't capture really effects of gender equality per se. So it does nominally, so in representation wise. I was wondering how, because labor force participation of women in GDP is kept fixed past 2030. We don't know what actually it would look like if there are increases. We don't know what it would look like with higher innovation. And okay, I don't need to go into urbanization. That's maybe a bit more speculative and complicated, but for these 2 key drivers, I think we could do a better job into incorporating this in our models. It's just a bigger picture of this. The implications of this, we argue in this paper, is that the SSP's challenges space would expand. So under assumptions of gender equality, you would have different trajectories that would push the scenario space a bit more to the extremes, except for the SSP2, which stays where it is. And that's because if we would endogenize this in our drivers, we would probably have even worse trends. So in an SSP3 world of inequality, things would get even worse. So vulnerabilities would be even higher. And the opposite would be observed in the SSP1. Therefore, the idea of expanding the scenario space. It would have consequences on decent living services, also something where we typically think of a household or a representative agent. We don't see these nuances that would give us further implications also for investments. Demand side changes, what I talked about earlier about behaviors. Do we all switch to low carbon behaviors, or do we all switch to high carbon intensive lifestyles? What does gender equality mean? Implications on just transition. How are jobs distributed? Do women remain outside or inside jobs in the energy transition, and so on? The point being, the scenario space would expand if we would do this modeling, and we could ask new and interesting research questions. I'll just stop here. I think I don't need to now reiterate why we need this. But basically, if you would like to consult some of the readings, you can. I put the papers, most papers that I presented here. So thanks.
Well, thanks a lot for this great presentation. I think everybody's English expression was hanging at your lips. So, anyway, it is a Dutch one. But for me, it was super insightful and sort of almost a shame to say I didn't really think about lots of these aspects.
I get this a lot.
Yeah, so I think that's good. It is, yeah, that you brought this up and then made this one of the presentations here. I was thinking actually about the space race and the doubling of brain power. So fun fact, the mother of Jack Beck the actor and rock star. She actually sort of saved the Apollo 13 mission. Just was also that. So she sort of came up with solutions to save the crew from the Apollo 13.
Okay, so I was showing there's like the Hidden Figures film also where like women did crucial or like even sending John Glenn into space.
Yeah.
The orbit.
I mean, this was, I think, a Russian lady, but oh, no,
No, never mind. But
yeah, super interesting. And yeah, is it okay for you, Kai, to start at a quarter to, what is it, 2?
Of course.
Yeah, great. So then we shift everything like 15 minutes.
We just have an hour lunch break.
Yeah, just enjoy your lunch break and also be, or yeah, depending on the questions, there will be questions. Just enjoy the sun. And, sorry? We have lunch here. So I assume it's already there, and then you just take your sandwich outside and chill outside or whatever you want. But let's take 2 very important questions, and then then the rest can be just discussed outside.
Yeah.
Generally with the perspective in the sense that that women would engage in sports and the men would be doing the earnings. So it would be like high class society, women can't go out and work. There would be some women who enjoy that.
Yeah.
But there would be somebody who does not enjoy that, who wants to work. So the men are like, oh no, the women are my family cannot. Because what will the society think that I cannot provide for the household and have to go out and work that way. But I was also thinking that the care work would be done by burning maids. So there would be somebody else who would take care of the children, but she would be more involved in the children's life, of course. But women would be more extracurricular activities of throwing lanterns, throwing stories, and
yeah, I think that's a very interesting thought. Yeah.
the second point is related to this one of the fictions that you showed, going out to take water. So there were some studies where like policymakers who tried to help, but they did not take into account the stakeholders. So there was a village where women used to go out to fetch water, and what they did was they installed some kind of a pump in that village. And then the women were annoyed because that was the only time of their day that they enjoyed, because they got to go out together and chit chat and whatnot.
Yeah.
There's another study where I read about that. Again, a pump was installed in the village, but not in that manner. So basically, children used to play in that village, right? So there is something like a marriage round of sorts. So they installed it in the sense that when children play that merry-go-round, the water is being pumped out. So it eventually turned into child labor, because every time that they wanted water, children have to play. So it's like when we think about those inequalities, and when we try to address those inequalities, we also have to make the people who are stakeholders a part of that solution.
Yeah, thanks. That's so important. I think that, yeah. Thanks for bringing this up. Funnily enough, like the first example that you gave with the time for women to spend time together, this very paper was pointed to me by another colleague exactly in this context. Yes.
Last one? No, we want to know.
Is there like any ideas of integrating like general economic indicators with just like gender-based indicators? We talk about work, for example, we talk about